Wikipedia officially launched for the first time on the 15th of January 2001, and since then it's served as the go-to resource for information on just about any subject. Students and school children use it for research when they're completing assignments. Internet users use it for research on a wide variety of topics, and even contains a wealth of information on celebrities, politicians, and sports stars. But some pages on Wikipedia are not for the faint of heart. They cover more serious and macabre subjects, such as abductions, paranormal encounters, serial killers, unexplained events from all through history, and people who have mysteriously disappeared, never to be seen or heard from again. Some people say that Mary Sweeny, also known by the names Maria, Marion, Anna, Annie Ricks, and Kit, to name but a few, was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, though no one is exactly sure of her birthplace, since it's been said that she was born in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. The same can be said for her birth year. Some resources state that she was born in 1858, while others list the date as either 1859 or 1862. But what's certain is that by the time she was in her mid-20s, she was already getting into trouble with the law. In 1882, it's said that she stole a dress from her employer, and by the time the next 3 years had passed, she'd been admitted to an asylum before being released again. At this point, she was working as a school teacher and had gotten married before having 2 children, named Philomena and Geraldine. It's unknown how it occurred, but at one stage in her life, Mary suffered an injury that caused a change in her personality and behavior. This is when things started getting truly strange, and the authorities had a hard time dealing with her. One day, Mary suddenly started breaking windows, not only in her own house, but everywhere she went. She would pick up items that she could find, whether it was a rock, a stick, or a random item, and hurl it through the nearest window. She would later state that she enjoyed the sound of the windows jingling, but this wasn't the only behavior that caused concern to those around her. She'd started drinking heavily and using illegal substances. She stated that these substances helped calm her nerves, though no one knew why they needed calming, since she didn't lead a particularly stressful life. Though it's thought that her injury may have contributed to this state of mind. In an effort to deal with her behavior, the police would lock her up in jail, send her to asylums and hospitals, or pay for her to get a train and leave town. But Mary was proud of the fact that she could escape from just about any hospital or asylum in a matter of days, and eventually the decision was made to have her mental health assessed. This did little to explain her behavior though, as it was quickly determined that she was completely sane and that the window smashing, which happened when she was seized by what she called a craze, was the exception to otherwise acceptable behavior. When Edward Schofield, the then governor of Wisconsin, heard about Mary's whims in 1897, he had her committed to Mendota Asylum for the insane, where she remained for a few years before being released. Mary's penchant for smashing windows had slowly started to fade, but it had been replaced by an uncontrollable urge to roam the countryside. But she kept breaking windows in order to get free train tickets from the authorities. She then wed a man named Anderson, and they had a son together. But when he found out that she'd been in a mental institution for a few years, he went his own way. Her son would be admitted to a home in 1912 for reasons unknown, and would eventually be charged with desertion during World War I. He spent some time in jail for this before being paroled, and by 1925, Mary was said to be looking for him, but it isn't known whether they ever reunited. The last thing known about her son is that he mysteriously disappeared from his workplace in 1924, and Mary's fate after that remains unknown. Another rather disconcerting page on Wikipedia is named List of Common Misconceptions. Here you'll find entry after entry of facts that many people consider to be common knowledge, but are completely untrue. One example of this is the misconception that the brand Adidas is short for All Day I Dream About Sports, or All Day I Dream About Soccer. The fact is, the company was named after its founder, Adolf Dassler, who was also known as Addy. Then there's the misconception that Santa Claus's image as a jolly elderly man with a white beard and large belly, dressed in a red outfit, was created by Coca-Cola as a marketing trick. In reality, that very image was already well known in the Americas since the 1800s. The next entry deals with a common belief that Twinkies will remain unspoiled and perfectly edible for years, and according to some people, decades. But Twinkies have an expiration date just like any other food, and are only good to eat for about 45 days. We might be accustomed to the fortune cookies we receive when eating Chinese food, but not many people know that they were actually invented in Japan, after which they made their way to the US and the rest of the world. They're actually considered to be quite a rarity in China, which comes as quite a surprise to most people. There's also a common belief that agricultural scientist George Washington Carver is the one who invented peanut butter, but this is far from true, since it's known that the Aztecs ate peanut butter as early as the 1400s. It's likely that people have this misconception due to the fact that Carver found hundreds of uses for peanuts, but he wasn't its inventor. One fact that everyone should be made aware of is that there's no law that states someone needs to wait 24 hours before reporting someone as missing. This misconception has hindered many missing person cases, and since the first 72 hours of a case are often considered to be the most crucial, it would be nonsensical to waste an entire day that could be used for furthering the investigation. In the world of sports, there's a misconception that the word golf is short for gentlemen only, ladies forbidden, but the word is thought to have originated from other languages. In Dutch, the word kalf means club. In Scottish, the word golf means to strike something, and the word likely originated from one of these. Then there's the common belief that the Egyptian pyramids are the result of slave labor, but this simply isn't true. According to this page on Wikipedia, the pyramids were constructed by skilled workmen and farmers who are not only well paid and fed, but whose income from this was exempt from taxation. Lastly, the belief that King Tut's tomb carried a curse with it, thanks to an inscription that was found when it was unearthed, is completely false. No one had ever spoken about a curse on the tomb until the 1900s, when sensationalist journalists included this trope in their reporting, and since then the curse has been depicted in several movies, books, and TV series. The Gibson Desert in Australia has been the site of the demise of many an explorer who were attempting to learn as much about the desolate area as possible. But not many people know that it was named for one of those men, Alfred Gibson. In 1874, Gibson was part of an expedition led by Ernest Giles, who explored much of Western and Southern Australia. And in this instance, his aim was to cross the Western Australian deserts from the east to the west. Gibson and Giles had met previously, though Giles only had a vague recollection of this. Before Giles could set out on his journey, though, he was approached by Gibson, who reminded them of their first meeting, and who then asked if he could join his expedition. Giles asked whether he knew how to shoe and ride a horse, and reminded him that he would almost certainly have to deal with the lack of food and water, and that there would be many dangers along the way, many of which could easily claim his life. But Gibson was undaunted, and even though Giles didn't think he was the best man for the job, he was allowed to join his crew since there was a serious shortage of volunteers. Gibson seemed passionate about his project, and thanks to his young age of 23, was likely to be an asset to the project. But at one point in the journey, they ran out of water while scouting ahead, and Gibson decided to return to their depot, leaving Giles behind without a horse. He took a compass and his horse with him, but it's believed that he somehow got lost as he never returned and was never seen again. It's likely that he succumbed to the desert heat along with dehydration and possibly hunger, but this remains mere speculation, as we'll likely never learn what his actual fate was after setting out alone. He's one of many explorers who are thought to have lost their lives in Australian deserts. The German explorer, Ludwig Leichhardt, set off into the Australian desert in 1848, and he too was never seen or heard from again. At the time, there were rumors that he and his party were accosted by a group of indigenous people who ended all of their lives before pilfering their belongings, which were later found scattered as far as 2,500 miles apart. In 1896, explorer Larry Wells led a group known as the Calvert Scientific Exploring Expedition and set off into the desert to find what had happened to Leichhardt and his party. He made use of camels to traverse the terrain, but at one point in the journey, two men in his party decided to go off on their own to do unrelated research, and they were eventually found deceased about 8 months later. While browsing Wikipedia, you may come across a page entitled Edward Mordake. While some people may be familiar with this case, it still isn't known whether he actually existed, but the story is enough to send chills down most people's spines. People first read about Mordake in 1859, when an article called The Wonders of Modern Science was published in the Boston Post, though it should be noted that it was penned by the well-known fiction author Charles Hildreth. The piece discussed what he referred to as human freaks, people who either possessed features that other people did or who lacked them. One example is a description that he gave of a woman who was likened to a mermaid since she had a fishtail. Another case described a man who didn't have a normal body, but that of a spider. Another man was said to be half human, half crab, but these accounts should be taken with a pinch of salt, since his work wasn't backed up by any sources or real facts. But his description of Mordake is one that just might keep you up at night. According to the article, Mordake was born in the 1800s, and surprisingly, he was very good looking, with people often describing him as having the same features as Antinous from ancient Greece. He was said to have been well-mannered and intelligent, but he had one feature that most people found terrifying, and in some cases repulsive, according to Hildreth. While Mordake seemed like a normal man at first glance, he also had a second face that was present on the back of his head. While we know that vestigial twins exist, this was said to be a unique case, since the second face was alive and sentient, and furthermore was the face of a woman. It was also intelligent in its own way, and could express emotions that were usually in direct contrast to the emotions Mordake was experiencing. When he smiled, the second face could be seen sneering, and when he felt sad, it had a smile on its face. This second face couldn't speak, didn't eat or drink, but it was somehow able to communicate with Mordake, much to his dismay. He told doctors that it kept him up at night, whispering things to him that he described as things that they only speak of in hell. He repeatedly visited doctors and asked that the devil twin, as he called it, be removed for his own sanity, but no doctor was brave enough to take on the operation, and so he was forced to live with it. His situation eventually took a toll on his mental health, and he became a recluse, staying in his room without any contact from the outside world. Here, he's said to have gradually lost his mind. His family tried to intervene, but he refused to see or speak to them, and when he passed away, he left a note behind asking that the face be destroyed, since he was worried that it would continue its whispers while he was in his grave. Mordake is said to have been buried in an unknown area, and since his grave contained no headstone, this legend, no matter how fictional it may be, lives on today, not only on Wikipedia, but in some scientific journals that have published the account when discussing vestigial twins or parasitic twins. The entry "sleep paralysis" is yet another Wikipedia page that causes people some discomfort, since it discusses a state of sleep during which people are awake and conscious, but are for some reason unable to move or talk. This is a very real phenomenon that leaves its sufferers not only baffled, but often terrified, since they're unable to explain why this happens, and hence it's thought in many cultures to be the results of something supernatural. During one of these episodes, the affected person is completely aware of what's going on around them, but they're unable to respond in any way. Added to this is the terrifying possibility that they may start hallucinating, hearing sounds, and seeing things that aren't really there. Some people have reported hearing sounds as mundane as a continuous buzzing, humming, or the sound of static. But there are some other far more terrifying accounts. Some people are adamant that they heard someone whispering or speaking to them, while others have heard the sound of an intense roar. Another terrifying possibility is that they'll see someone unfamiliar standing in the room with them, or worse, a dark, unmoving figure that seems to watch them while they're completely paralyzed. There have also been many reports that during one of these episodes, the sufferer feels as if someone is lying or sitting on their chest, making it hard for them to breathe and further causing them great distress. It's mainly thanks to this symptom that some people believe it's caused by creatures called the sleep paralysis demons, or in some cultures, night hags. It's easy to understand why someone would think this could be supernatural, since they feel like they're being watched by a dark shape that's stopping them from breathing properly, speaking, or even moving. But strangely, as soon as the episode ends, their bodily functions return to normal. In some cases, people have reported feeling as if they were being dragged out of their beds by some unseen force, or that they experienced something akin to an out-of-body experience, finding that they can suddenly fly. Some people have also reported it feeling a tingling sensation, like mild electricity, vibrations, or numbness throughout their bodies. But these always seem to disappear as soon as they wake us properly. To make matters even more mysterious, no one has been able to find the cause for sleep paralysis, despite hundreds of studies being conducted throughout the years. The best we've been able to do so far is come up with a few theories. Some experts believe that sleep paralysis occurs when REM sleep and waking states overlap for reasons unknown, resulting in parasomnia. Thus, the sufferer feels that they're awake and asleep at the same time. It's also been suggested that it's the result of neural functions that are out of sync, specifically those that control our states of sleep. One neural function tells the brain that the sufferer is asleep, while another reports that they're awake, and hence they're conscious but unable to move. While its causes are still being studied, it's been noted that sleep paralysis might occur when someone is suffering from sleep deprivation. And luckily, it doesn't result in any medical complications after the fact, though it has been associated with pre-existing narcolepsy. In China, the condition is referred to as ghost oppression, and in Newfoundland, it's called the old hag syndrome. In Mexico, some people believe that a deceased person has climbed on top of them while they're asleep, rendering them immobile. The Flatwoods monster, according to Wikipedia, is also known as Braxy, the Braxton County monster, and the Phantom of Flatwoods, and it describes a creature that was reportedly spotted in West Virginia on the 12th of September, 1952. On that evening, at around 7:15 p.m., brothers Edward and Fred May, along with their friend Tom Heyer, were playing on the grounds of their school when they saw a mysterious red pulsating light streaking across the sky in West Virginia. As they watched it travel, they realized it had landed on a nearby farm that belonged to a man named G. Bailey Fisher, and they immediately ran to the brothers' house, where they told their mother what they had seen. Together, they ran to the area where they saw the light landing, and were soon joined by a few other boys, one of which had his dog with him. At the front of the search party was Gene Lemon, a member of the National Guard. As they climbed a hill to get to the landing site, Lemon suddenly reported that he could see a set of glowing eyes that were looking at them from a nearby tree. He peered into the darkness to try and make out what he was looking at, but he then let out a blood-curdling scream and fell over backward. He said that he'd seen a 10-foot-tall creature that he described as a monster that had a green glowing face and a red body. He believed that it had claws instead of hands, but he stated that he wasn't sure since the night was filled with a heavy mist. The group later claimed that the creature had a spade-shaped head and seemed to be wearing a dress made out of a material that resembled metal. Its eyes glowed orange, and to them it seemed as though it was floating a few inches off the ground. They then realized that the air was filled with a strange, pungent smell, and in the background they could see the pulsating light that had streaked across the night sky just a short while earlier. Before they had time to react, the monster suddenly let out a loud hiss and started gliding towards the group, prompting them to turn and flee as quickly as they could. The group was traumatized by the event, and some experienced medical conditions afterward. A few people reported suffering from throat irritations and nausea that lingered for days after the incident. While it's been speculated that the group may have been exposed to mustard gas, authorities at the time didn't take these reports seriously and decided that they were likely the result of hysteria. Nevertheless, the police went to the site and conducted a search, but they reported that everything seemed normal. But this was not the first time that this strange creature was seen, according to some reports. A resident of Heaters, about 5 miles from Flatwoods, Audra Harper, reported that she and a friend had been walking in the woods close to her house while they were on their way to a store, when they noticed what looked like a fireball on a nearby hill. At first, they thought nothing of it, but when she looked back at the hill, the fire had disappeared, and instead she saw a tall figure silhouetted against the sky. They didn't investigate further and instead decided to flee. The day after the boys encountered the creature, George and Edith Snitowski were traveling by car between Clay and Braxton counties when the car's engine inexplicably shut off on a deserted road. The car wouldn't start again no matter what they tried, and they then became aware of a foul odor in the air. Suddenly, they were surrounded by a bright light, and they saw a 10-foot-tall creature levitating before their very eyes. The creature was described as akin to a lizard. It then turned, ran its hand across the hood of the car, and floated away into the nearby woods. They were then able to start the car's engine and drove away at speed. It's been suggested that this creature was actually a barn owl that was sighted after a meteor streaked across the sky, but this remains mere speculation. When it comes to eating disorders, there are many people who will state that a Frenchman named Tarrare, who lived from 1772 to 1798, had the worst case ever recorded. When we think of these disorders, most people associate them with people who struggle to eat, but Tarrare had quite the opposite problem. He served France as a soldier during the War of the First Coalition, which ranged from 1792 to 1797. And during his service, he and his fellow soldiers were well provided for. But the food that was provided for Tarrare was nowhere near enough. He was on several occasions seen eating waste heaps and gutters since he was almost always hungry, and no amount of food provided to him could satisfy his need for more. This meant that he was almost always looking for food, and soon he lost so much weight that he had to be sent to a hospital for treatment. Here, doctors tried to find a reason for his condition, and on one occasion he was tested. He was given a meal that could feed 15 people, but he finished it in a single sitting without any problem. It was also reported that when he was admitted to hospital again, on a later occasion, he snuck out and was found eating from a butcher shop's waste area. When he was unable to find any sustenance, he would eat lizards and eels, but no matter how much he ate, he remained underweight. While serving in the military, it became clear that something had to be done, and he received 4 times the normal food rations, but even then he remained as hungry as ever. He was then sent to have his mental state analyzed, but it was found that he was completely sane, and no one could find a reason for his ferocious appetite. Upon hearing of Tarrare, a general decided that he should be put to work as a spy. He was ordered to swallow important documents before traveling to a certain destination, where they would be retrieved. While this may sound farcical, the plan was approved but didn't quite go to plan. On his very first mission, Tarrare was captured by the enemy and he was eventually sent back to France after being assaulted. By this point, he'd had enough of his condition and stated that he would do whatever it took to lead a normal life. But doctors couldn't cure him of his condition, no matter what they tried, and he was eventually thrown out of the hospital when it came to light that he'd been sneaking out. For the next 4 years, no one knew what had become of him, but he was eventually spotted again in Versailles. But he had contracted a severe case of tuberculosis, and a short while later it would claim his life. Before he passed, he stated that he'd swallowed a golden fork a few years prior, and he believed this to be the cause of his failing health. But his autopsy revealed that no fork was present. To this day, it isn't known what drove Tarrare to such hunger, and while a few other similar cases have been noted through the years, the condition remains a mystery. When it comes to the paranormal side of Wikipedia, many people feel that the entry regarding shadow people is among the most terrifying, with some stating that they've seen figures in their own homes. Those who have had these encounters report that they often see a figure that's seemingly made up of nothing but shadow moving in the periphery of their vision, never allowing them to get a direct look at them. In many of these cases, people describe the shadow as that of a person, but much larger than it should be. They're also reported as moving quickly and with arrested movements before they suddenly disappear, often into mirrors and walls or merging with other shadows. Some of these figures are said to be solid, like a human, while others appear to be a mist. It's also been reported that some shadow people have eyes that can easily be seen in stark contrasting darkness of their bodies. These eyes could be white, red, green, or blue, but it's said that those with eyes move faster than others. They're also reportedly more intelligent and move about soundlessly to avoid detection. While most people who encounter a shadow person feel that they're in danger and that they're evil creatures, others have stated that they regard them as something similar to a guardian angel who's watching over them. Some people claim that each shadow person has its own personality, just like humans do, and some are evil, while others are either indifferent or act as guardians. Some witnesses have stated that when they looked into the creature's eyes, it suddenly let out a scream that was similar to static or a howling wind. During some encounters, witnesses are left immobilized, and the shadow person will simply stand in front of them silently, staring at them attentively, as if they're being studied. According to some reports, they can often be seen in hospitals near people who are ill or on the verge of passing away. Shadow people have also been mentioned in the same breath as sleep paralysis, as some people have reported that the creatures would climb onto their chests while they're unable to move, causing them to struggle to breathe. Strangely, people from many different parts of the world have reported seeing one particular shadow person, known as the Hat Man. He's described as a solid shadow with either red or black eyes, who wears a wide-brimmed hat and what looks like a long trench coat. As if this isn't disconcerting enough, he's said to emit an aura of malevolence, and he's often reported as seeming to curiously study those that encounter him. While most people don't know what he is or where he came from, others are adamant that he's the devil himself. It's been suggested by some theorists that these creatures may be extraterrestrials that are attempting to hide their identities by appearing as shadows. Those who see it as an evil entity claim that it can be chased away by prayer or by ordering it to leave in the name of Jesus. While Wikipedia is by no means a reliable source of the diagnosing of medical conditions, it does contain a massive amount of information on existing conditions. One of the most bizarre and terrifying being Cotard syndrome. This is a syndrome that affects a person's mental state, and they end up convinced that they either no longer exist, that they've passed away, or that they're inexplicably missing some of their vital organs. Studies have revealed that around 45% of people suffering from Cotard syndrome believe that they're no longer alive, while the remaining 55% feel that they've somehow become immortal. In one case, a woman known only as Mademoiselle X suffered from the condition, and she claimed that she was missing several parts of her body. Further to this were her claims that she never needed to eat since she'd been condemned to eternal damnation. She would eventually pass away from starvation. In another case, a 65-year-old man who worked as a school teacher started feeling depressed one day without explanation. This sadness seemed to be worse in the morning after he woke up, and soon it had affected him so badly that he started struggling to socialize with other people. He struggled to sleep and often felt anxious without reason. He had very little appetite and eventually started feeling that something disastrous was about to happen, often stating that the world and everything in it was about to be destroyed. He told his family that his house's walls were cracking and that it was going to collapse on top of him. He felt that some of his organs, including his brain, were no longer functioning, and he worried that his condition might be passed to others like an infection. When he was eventually admitted to a hospital, he was found to be severely depressed and that he'd started believing that he'd passed away some time ago. His depression was treated with various medications, resulting in his mental state returning to normal after 7 weeks. Another sufferer of Cotard syndrome, a 62-year-old woman named Mrs. A, reported to doctors that she'd been suffering from bipolar disorder for about 35 years, but that it had been under control with medication, until she started becoming convinced that some of her family members didn't actually exist, despite the fact that she recognized them. As with the previous case, she became convinced that her house would one day collapse, and when she revealed this to her family, they decided to book her into a hospital for treatment. She also had become mute at this point. Here, it was revealed that she believed she was missing some of her organs, and she thought she'd passed away. She refused to eat since she didn't think it was necessary for someone who was no longer alive to do so, and soon her limbs started to become rigid. She was found to be severely dehydrated and depressed, coupled with anemia and a vitamin D deficiency. Doctors were able to treat her condition with medication and a series of electroshock therapies that steadily caused an improvement in her condition. And after some time, she returned to normal and was able to live a normal life. To this day, it isn't known what causes Cotard syndrome, but thankfully, we have a good idea of how to treat it. Wikipedia contains an entry about a road in West Milford, New Jersey that's said to be extremely haunted, named Clinton Road. The road starts at Route 23 and ends about 10 miles to the north of Upper Greenwood Lake. Though some people, such as members of law enforcement, believe these tales are merely the result of overactive imaginations that are stimulated by the road's dark and desolate nature, others believe that there's something very sinister about the road and its surrounding woods. The first of these areas is called Ghost Boy Bridge. According to folklore, anyone can contact the spirit of a young boy if they were to place a quarter in the middle of the road, as long as it's placed on one of the road's bridges. It's said that the quarter will be brought back to that person by the boy's spirit, but if they remain in the area and dare to look over the edge of the bridge, they'll be pushed into the water of Clinton Brook. Others have reported seeing a girl driving a phantom Chevrolet Camaro on this stretch of road, and it's said that it's the spirit of a woman who lost her life in a crash there in 1988. Some people claim that one merely needs to mention the incident while on the road for her to appear. This isn't the only phantom vehicle on this road, though. Some people claim to have seen a ghostly pickup truck driving on the road, while others see nothing but a set of floating headlights. On some occasions, it's said these headlights will suddenly turn around and start chasing the witnesses' vehicles, only to disappear into thin air when they reach the end of Clinton Road. Then there's the legend of the park rangers. Several people who have camped in the area reported seeing these two rangers close to Terrence Pond, and they then realized that they're the spirits of two rangers who passed away in the woods in 1939. Some visitors reported seeing strangely dressed people in these woods who would simply stare at them without saying a word before suddenly disappearing before their very eyes. In some instances, people would point these people out to their companions, who then discover that they aren't able to see the figures at all. Many people have stated that they've encountered inexplicable creatures while traveling on Clinton Road. One of these is thought to be an albino wolf dog that was the result of a failed experiment, and others have reported seeing other animal hybrids roaming around the area. Lastly, there's the legend of the phantom hitchhiker. This is said to be the spirit of a young girl who suddenly appears by the side of the road, trying to hitch a ride with passing motorists. People are often taken aback by the fact that a girl would be out there alone, but when they approach her with their cars, she suddenly disappears, leaving them terrified. While most people believe these tales to be mere folklore, many others are adamant about what they saw, and they try to avoid Clinton Road whenever possible. There are many Wikipedia articles about unusual islands around the world. Some of these hold animals or plant species found nowhere else on the planet. Others have geographical landscapes that seem like they're not from this world. At first, Pheasant Island, on the border between Spain and France, doesn't seem too unusual, but the island has one of the strangest histories and holds the record for the world's smallest condominium. Pheasant Island is a small islet located in the Bedoya River. It's only 200 meters long and 40 meters wide, and looks more like a collection of trees in the middle of the river than any significant island. Even though the island is only a few miles from the mouth of the river, Bedoya is relatively narrow at this point. There are only 10 meters between the island and the Spanish banks of the river, and only 20 meters of water separate it from the French banks. At low tide, it's even possible to walk from the Spanish bank to the island. But this little sliver of land has seen more than its fair share of history. It was recognized in Roman times when it was given the name steppe or passage. Over time, that name changed into one meaning pheasant, even though no pheasants live on the island today. While the island would have been a part of many important events since the Romans first gave it that name, its main significance today began at the end of the 30 Years' War. The Franco-Spanish War that formed part of that conflict continued until 1648, when a ceasefire was finally declared. The two sides needed a neutral space to negotiate peace and plan the future relationship between the two countries. Sitting near the center of the river that separated the two countries, Pheasant Island was chosen as the location for these talks. 24 summits took place, with important delegations from both sides meeting on the tiny island to discuss the fates of both countries. Finally, in 1659, the Treaty of the Pyrenees was signed. As part of the treaty, an arrangement was made for the two countries to share Pheasant Island. Pheasant Island is the oldest condominium that still exists today. A condominium is an area of land controlled by two or more different sovereign nations. Many are the result of uneasy agreements between the two nations. In some cases, such as Antarctica, dozens of countries came together to agree not to fight over the land. Things are different on Pheasant Island. Every 6 months, France and Spain swap ownership of the island. From February 1st to July 31st, the island is under Spanish control, and for the remainder of the year it belongs to the French. The island has no inhabitants, and traveling there is only permitted during special heritage days. Ownership of the island is really just a case of trimming the trees and cutting undergrowth. This wasn't the only important historical event that took place on the island, though. It was here where King Louis XIV of France met his future wife, Maria Theresa of Spain. In 1660, the two monarchs were married on the island. Decades later, Louis XV met Mariana Victoria of Spain. The two were intended to be married, but the wedding never occurred. Today, the island remains an important, if little-known piece of history. There are few more pivotal events in the history of the Eastern Roman Empire that were triggered by as strange an event as the Nika riots. What could at first be compared to modern-day football hooliganism evolved into something that almost deposed the emperor and led to the rebuilding of Constantinople. The Wikipedia article forms a starting point for the rabbit hole of this strange event. The Nika riots, or Nika revolt, took place over the course of a week in January of 532. At the time, one of the sporting events that still took place was the chariot races, which were enjoyed by Roman citizens from all levels of society. Like modern-day sports, the races had their own teams, named after the color that the charioteers and their horses wore. By the time of Emperor Justinian I, the primary teams were the blues and the greens, and almost everyone in Constantinople would align themselves with one or the other. The blues and the greens were more than typical sports fandom. Some scholars believe that they might have been political parties, though they didn't really have characteristics that distinguished them from one another. Rather, they were simply two factions that would often be at loggerheads. The authorities that resembled Constantinople's police couldn't do their job without the blues and greens keeping one another in check. Over the decades, one side or the other would gain slightly more power depending on which was supported by the emperor. In his youth, Justinian had been a supporter of the blues, but had since tried to take a more neutral stance. It was hoped that this would then take some power away from both the blues and the greens, but it may have simply led to them having more in common. In the background, Justinian was making a great deal of reforms, including to the legal code and taxes. He was also still at war with the Persians, which was taking a great deal of money and attention. He was very unpopular, especially with the nobles, who were losing power due to the shrinking of the civil service. All this led to a very precarious state, which would erupt on January 13th. Days later, another smaller riot had taken place. The ringleaders were rounded up and would have their lives taken by the authorities. But two of these managed to escape and sought refuge in a church. One of the men was a blue and the other was a green. The police demanded the emperor pardon the two men who had escaped. At first, Justinian ignored this wish, then converted the punishment to imprisonment. This wasn't enough. During a day of races on January 13th, the blues and greens joined forces and began a chant of Nika. This would often be heard at the hippodrome where the races took place. It meant victory or conquer, and was typically shouted to encourage the charioteers. This time, it was being aimed at the emperor. The shouting turned to violence, and Justinian returned to his palace as the violence spilt onto the streets of Constantinople. Fires were set, and the rioters prevented them from being put out. It wasn't long before senators and other nobles caught wind of the activity and began to arm the rioters and show support. They hoped that the force could be used to depose the emperor and place another person on the throne. At one point, Justinian considered leaving the city, but his wife Theodora famously argued against this, and a new plan was put together. Most of the rioters were again in the hippodrome, when two sets of imperial troops were sent there, trapping them inside. All the rioters in the hippodrome lost their lives. The government forces then rounded up those that remained, including the nobles who had opposed Justinian, and dealt with them. It's estimated that the riots cost the lives of between 30,000 and 35,000 people, but it secured Justinian's throne. It removed from power most of his enemies, and his construction projects in Constantinople made him popular. To this day, the Hagia Sophia that Justinian had rebuilt remains an important symbol in Istanbul. Mass bird casualty events are a strange and disturbing phenomenon wherever they occur. Most of the time, these are one-off events that perplex the locals but are quickly forgotten about when there's no repeat. But in the Indian village of Jatinga, the phenomenon happens so regularly, the area has earned the nickname the Bermuda Triangle of Birds. The village is a settlement of about 2,500 people, located on a ridge of the same name, and nestled in the Boreal Mountains. Every year, between the months of September and November, locals will wake up to find countless birds littering the streets. Some are still alive, wandering around disoriented and confused. Most have succumbed to wounds caused by flying into buildings, bamboo poles, or the ground itself. The phenomenon only occurs at night between the hours of 7 and 10 p.m., and only under very specific conditions. It must be foggy, cloudy, or misty, with no natural moonlight to help the birds orient themselves. However, this is a relatively frequent occurrence during the late monsoon season. Strangely, it only occurs in a small area of the ridge, roughly 1.5 kilometers long and 200 meters wide, and the victim birds only arrive from the north rather than the south. It was the Naga people, native to northeast India, who first described the mysterious event in around the year 1900. For them, the shocking event could only have been the influence of some evil spirit. They took the scattered bodies of birds as a sign that the place should be avoided and decided not to settle there. In 1905, the Jatinga people arrived in the area and witnessed the same phenomenon. But rather than being scared by the incident, they took it as a positive sign. The meat from the birds was interpreted as a gift from the gods, and over the years, traps were set up to increase the number of birds that would meet their end in the village. It wasn't until the 1960s when the strange event was brought to global attention, after naturalist EPG visited the region and witnessed it for himself. Since then, scientists and ornithologists have been trying to solve the mystery of why this occurs. Rather than being a gift or curse from the gods, it was assumed that there was some kind of natural explanation, but to this day that hasn't been found. It's believed that the birds are forced to migrate due to rising water during the monsoon season. Their nests are destroyed and they have no choice but to move on. The birds then become disoriented in the fog and wind and fly toward the lights from the village to reorient themselves. They then crash into poles or buildings, but why they become disoriented isn't clear, and why this happened before there was even a village here is just one of the unsolved questions. There are a few factors that add to how perplexing this mystery is. Many different types of birds have been recorded as becoming casualties of this strange phenomenon, but they are typical local migratory birds. Long-distance migratory birds seem to be immune to whatever pull is causing the problem. Another unusual, uninhabited island that has its own Wikipedia article is the tiny island of Ernst Thalmann Island off the coast of Cuba. It's never been inhabited, and there are no man-made structures on the island, but it could be the last territory of East Germany. For decades, Ernst Thalmann Island was unofficially part of the communist German state, even after East and West Germany reunited. Up until 1972, there'd never been much attention paid to the island. It has an unusual shape and is one of many islands that curve away in a trail from the infamous Bay of Pigs. The island is only 1.5 kilometers long and 500 meters wide at its widest point. The only things that live there are iguanas and some seabirds. But when Cuban leader Fidel Castro came to Germany on a tour of Eastern Europe in 1972, it gained international attention. Castro had arrived in East Germany as part of a tour of the Warsaw Pact countries, strengthening ties between his own state and the Soviet Union. He arrived in Berlin on June 19th to meet with the East German ruler, Erich Honecker. Castro was presented with a collection of small gifts and responded by gifting the island to the German people. He showed the island to the East German politicians, highlighting the fact that it was near the Bay of Pigs. The island was to be renamed after Ernst Thalmann, a German politician and the leader of the German Communist Party before the Second World War. He'd lost his life in 1944, but he remained an important symbolic figure in the communist East Germany. Many streets and public buildings were named after him, and the East German Youth Division had its members pledge to work and fight as Thalmann taught. The main beach on the island was also to be renamed to GDR Beach, or German Democratic Republic Beach. 2 months later, a group of representatives from East Germany and Cuba gathered on the island on the anniversary of Ernst Thalmann's passing. A ceremony took place, and a statue of the German politician was unveiled. This was possibly the highest number of people to ever set foot on the island at once. At the time, There had been plans in East Germany to develop the island into a vacation destination for German tourists, but that would never happen. East Germans had only just gained the right to move into other Warsaw Pact countries, and very few people had the money to travel across the world for a vacation. There also wasn't the money for any of the development work necessary, and the island was left mostly forgotten. One of the few people who did actually visit Ernst Thalmann Island was Frank Schobel, a singer. A music video was filmed there, and some footage was used in a documentary designed to highlight the relationship between Cuba and East Germany, but the song was met with little success. By the time East and West Germany were unified, Ernst Thalmann Island had mostly been forgotten. It wasn't named in any of the documents that were signed. In 2001, a German online newspaper suggested that this meant the island was still part of East Germany, or at least was now under German control. But both Cuban and German officials insisted that Castro's gift of the island had only ever been symbolic, and the island had always been a part of Cuba. In the late 17th century, the Kingdom of Scotland decided to join other European nations in trying to carve out a piece of the New World for itself. The Darien scheme was an ambitious plan to start a colony in Central America. Even though it was short-lived, it had a lasting impact on Scottish history in a way the investors couldn't have expected. The Darien Gap is the name given to a region of southern Panama and northern Colombia that connects Central and South America. Even today, the region is notoriously difficult to traverse and is undeveloped. When the Pan American Highway was being built, it was discovered that the marshy area made it impossible to build roads there. It remains a 60-mile break in the highway to this day. In the late 1600s, explorers from Europe had no reason to believe this part of the New World would be any more difficult to settle than the rest of Central America. The Darien scheme hoped to take advantage of what looked like the perfect opportunity to control trade between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It was only a thin stretch of land that separated the two oceans, and merchants hoped to set up an overland connection between the two bodies of water. In 1695, the Company of Scotland was created by an act of the Parliament of Scotland. At the time, Scotland was in personal union with England, as the two countries shared the same monarch, but they were still two separate countries. Scotland was far behind England when it came to its economy and position on the world stage. An unusually cold winter had also caused a famine, which hit Scotland hard, adding to its problems. The Company of Scotland intended to trade in Africa and the Indies, but it wasn't long before the Darien scheme was formed. At first, it was financed through backers from England, Scotland, and mainland Europe. However, there was a lot of opposition to the company in England. Not only was the English East India Company opposed to another company that seemed to be cutting into its market, but the Darien scheme would put Scotland in opposition to the Spanish. England was trying to avoid war with the Spanish, so investors from there and from Europe pulled out of the venture. Despite this, the Company of Scotland went ahead. Between a quarter and a half of all available money in Scotland was invested into the company. Ordinary people, especially in lowlands, invested, and thousands of people signed up to become the first colonists in Darien. In 1698, the first expedition took place, taking 1,200 people to the area. Even before they arrived, the colonists faced difficulties, and many had already passed away before they set foot in the New World. Still, the remaining colonists settled the area they called Caledonia, and tried to make the land work for them, but it didn't work. Infighting, harsh conditions, and a lack of support from other European colonies meant the Darien scheme was doomed to failure. After just 8 months, the colony was abandoned, but news hadn't traveled back to Scotland yet. More colonists arrived, only to find the ruined remains of huts and the graves of 400 people who'd come before them. One more failed attempt at settling the land came in 1699, before the Darien scheme was abandoned. The scheme had taken so much money out of the Scottish economy and claimed the lives of thousands of people that it put the entire kingdom in trouble. There's still debate about how much impact the Darien scheme had on Scotland's future, but many believe that the scheme made lowland Scots more open to the idea of a political union with England, paving the way for the Acts of Union in 1707. Wikipedia keeps lists of some of the most audacious and strangest robberies in history, but there are a few as unusual as the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist that took place between 2011 and 2012. Over the course of almost a year, syrup worth around 18.7 Canadian dollars was stolen from a warehouse in Quebec. It was the most valuable heist in Canadian history. Maple syrup is a surprisingly expensive substance. Barrels of syrup are worth more than the equivalent in crude oil, and the prices are tightly controlled by the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. 77% of the world's maple syrup supply comes from the French-Canadian province, so controlling the market here means controlling the market around the world. In order to control the market, the FPAQ has a maple syrup reserve, where all the producers in Quebec keep their harvest. It means that the syrup can be supplied to consumers year-round and protects producers from a bad harvest. Combined with advertising efforts from the organization, this keeps the price of maple syrup stable and high. The FPAQ isn't without its critics, though, and some producers in Quebec are unhappy with the hold the organization has on the industry. Among those were Richard Vallières, who had previously found ways to get around the Federation's supply management system. Vallières had previously gotten into trouble with the FPAQ and was fined $1.8 million for selling syrup illegally. He blamed the Federation for his house being seized. When he was approached by a man with an opportunity to get back at the Federation and make money in the process, he was soon on board. The man was Avik Karen. In the spring of 2011, the Federation had rented space in a warehouse owned by his wife. It gave Karen access to millions of dollars worth of syrup. Together with accomplices, Karen and Vallières transported barrels of syrup to a sugar shake where the barrels were drained and the contents were replaced with water. After a month, barrels of syrup were removed and replaced with the barrels of water. The Federation only takes stock of the supply once a year, so the operation was able to go on for months without anybody noticing. Eventually, the thieves became so confident that they drained the barrels while they were still in the warehouse and didn't bother to replace them. The syrup was then transported out of the state, where it could be sold without the control of the Federation. Much of the syrup was sold to distributors who had no idea that the goods were stolen. Some were transported over the border into the US, where the controls on the syrup trade were also looser. In July of 2012, the annual inspection of the syrup began. An inspector climbed a stack of barrels. One that should have been too heavy to move came loose and he almost fell. It was only then that the theft was discovered. It was difficult to trace the stolen syrup, as there was nothing different about this than any other maple syrup. But the police were able to identify 5 people involved in the scheme. Karen and Vallières were caught, and Karen eventually pleaded guilty to his part in the crime. Vallières, his father, and 2 other individuals stood trial. Vallières was considered to be the ringleader, and was sentenced to 8 years in prison and fined $9.4 million. Karen was sentenced to 5 years in prison, while the other accomplices received lesser sentences. In the aftermath of the heist, the Federation moved to a more secure warehouse, with CCTV monitoring 24 hours a day to keep track of the expensive syrup. Many of the more dark and disturbing events in modern history are recorded through Wikipedia articles. Some of these are well known, while others might never get the attention they deserve. The case of Albert Stevens is the latter. Albert was a house painter from Ohio who moved to California with his wife in the 1920s. They lived relatively unremarkable lives and would have continued in this manner if it were not for stomach problems that Albert began to experience in the mid-1940s. A local doctor told Albert that he might have a stomach ulcer, and he suggested he go to the University of California hospital to get checked out. It was there that he got the devastating diagnosis of stomach cancer. Doctors at the hospital believed he wouldn't have long left to live, and Albert was secretly selected for an experiment. The University of California Hospital was one of the many locations across the US that was helping the Manhattan Project. Work was just beginning on developing a nuclear weapon, but not every experiment conducted as part of the project was designed around causing destruction. In fact, in many cases, scientists wanted to prevent destruction. There was still a lot to understand about the radioactive material that was being used, including what were the safe doses for workers to be exposed to. Staff on the project were worried about falling ill if any accidents happened, but monitoring the impact of this radiation was difficult. In particular, some of the materials being used only emitted alpha particles. If ingested, the radioactivity wouldn't be able to escape from the body, and it would be very difficult to detect in a living person. At first, experiments took place on rats. However, it was impossible to know how the information gathered in these experiments could be extrapolated to humans, without any kind of human experiments. Patients at various hospitals were also selected to take part in experiments. The scientists wanted to select those with terminal illnesses, but who didn't have anything wrong with their metabolism. This way, they figured they were limiting the damage done to the patient, as they wouldn't have long to live anyway, but the results could be comparable to a healthy worker. Albert was the first patient from the University of California to be selected for the experiment, and was given the number CAL1. He was injected with a large dose of plutonium and days later went into surgery. At no point was Albert informed of what exactly he was being injected with, and his wife and daughter figured it was some kind of experimental treatment. During surgery, it was discovered that Albert didn't have cancer at all. In fact, he was suffering from an ulcer and severe inflammation, but it was nothing that would have shortened his life expectancy. Despite this, the experiment continued. Samples were taken from Albert's body and taken to the research lab to be examined. Albert wasn't told that he never had cancer, only that the treatment had worked. For years after the experiment, he continued to provide samples to the hospital so they could monitor his supposed recovery. Albert had been exposed to the highest known accumulated radiation dose of any human. The plutonium that he'd been injected with stayed in his system for the rest of his life, giving him a yearly dose of 300 rem. The annual dose that radiation workers in the US are permitted to be exposed to is 5. Despite this, Albert continued to live for another 20 years after the experiment, and only passed away due to heart disease. It was only years later that his family discovered the truth about the treatment that he and 17 other people had undergone. Almost a quarter of a century on from the panic around the Y2K bug, there's another similar problem on the horizon that could have devastating impacts if it isn't solved soon. But like Y2K, the year 2038 problem is one that will likely be resolved relatively easily. The Y2K bug was a computer problem that caused panic before the turn of the millennium. At the time, computer systems stored dates in a 2-digit format. The year 1999 was represented as 99. On New Year's Day of 2000, these computers would read the date as 00 and would interpret the date as January 1st, 1900. This would be a serious problem for systems that require the correct date to function properly. There were concerns about planes falling from the sky and operating systems at important facilities failing. When January 1st came around, none of these problems happened. This was largely due to an effort by computer programmers and IT experts, and very few faults actually occurred. But there is another similar problem that will occur in 2038 that still needs to be solved. Computer systems measure the date and time using a signed 32-bit integer system. The time is measured as the number of seconds since midnight on January 1st, 1970. But the computer cannot count seconds forever. The 32-bit system means that it can only store 32 binary digits. Being signed means that the range covers both negative and positive numbers. Put together, this means that computers using a 32-bit system can only count up to January 19th, 2038 at 3:14:07. If the computer tries to count another second, it'll go into integer overflow. The system could completely crash and fail, or simply flip over to negative numbers. This would make the computers believe that the date was December 13th, 1901. This date is the exact amount of seconds before January 1st, 1970, as January 19th, 2038 is after that date. Like in the case of the Y2K bug, this could have significant consequences for anything that requires an accurate date input to function. But again, like in the case of the Y2K bug, it's a problem that software engineers are aware of. Even when they were fixing the problems associated with the year 2000, some solutions were put into place for the 2038 problem. Many computer systems have already moved to a 64-bit system rather than a 32-bit one. This doesn't just push the problem back another few decades, but exponentially increases the life of these programs. It would take 292 billion years for a 64-bit system to overflow, which is longer than the current estimated age of the universe. This solution alone isn't without its faults, and there are other places where simply updating the system isn't an option. Embedded systems are those that are designed to last the entire lifetime of the machine they're a part of. They don't have regular software updates like phones. Examples of these embedded systems include automotive systems like anti-lock braking systems and traction control. In some cases, it may be impossible for a software update to take place, and the entire system would have to be replaced with one without the 32-bit limitations. But there's still plenty of time for these changes to take place, and it's likely the consequences of the year 2038 problem will be the same as those of the Y2K bug. Wikipedia tends to not have too many articles about events that happen on the site itself. Even details about famous people editing their own Wikipedia articles are often considered not significant enough to be preserved in the online encyclopedia. But some events, such as the Jamal hoaxes, are so significant that they're worthy of preservation. The Jamal hoaxes are one of the largest series of hoax articles in Wikipedia's history. There are countless instances of someone either intentionally or accidentally including false information about various subjects on the site. Most of these are removed within a couple of hours, but some can take days or even years to notice, especially when the article is written in a language that would be foreign to most people reading it. The Jamal hoaxes stood out not just for how long they went unnoticed, but for the quality and quantity of the hoax articles. The Wikipedia user Jamal began her work in 2010, when she began adding small details to the Chinese version of an article on the Qing Dynasty official. It was in 2012 that the main bulk of her hoaxes began. Jamal started to write Chinese language articles about Russian medieval history. The user wrote about wars between the various Russian states, going into detail about their clothes and even cooking utensils. She contributed millions of words on everything from the Kashan silver mine to the deportation of Chinese people during the Soviet era. Jamal seemed to be an expert in the field. On her profile, she claimed to be the child of a Chinese diplomat living in Russia. She had a PhD in history from Moscow State University and had married a Russian man. She wrote with an authoritative tone and used sources that seemed legitimate. For example, one of her most commonly used sources was the Chinese language edition of the book History of Russia from the Earliest Times. Other Wikipedia editors had no reason to believe she wasn't legitimate, especially when other accounts backed up her credentials. It wasn't until 2022 that Jamal's hoaxes were revealed. It was actually her article about the Kashan silver mine that was her undoing. According to her article, the mine was an incredibly important source of wealth and had triggered multiple wars with the Dukes of Moscow. The article even went into detail about the soil composition of the mine and linked to other extensive articles about the wars. The mine caught the attention of a fantasy novelist looking for inspiration in real history. But when he checked out the sources that Jamal used, they didn't add up. He spoke to Russian scholars and found that there was no such thing as the Kashan silver mine. Looking deeper, the novelist found that there were countless Chinese language articles about Russian topics that were far more extensive than the English or Russian language version of those articles. Many didn't even have corresponding articles in Russian. Other Wikipedia editors began to investigate the discrepancies, and Jamal was exposed as a fraud. In an apology letter left on her profile, Jamal explained that she was a Chinese housewife who didn't speak English or Russian and had no knowledge of the subjects she wrote about. Her editing campaign had started out by using online translators to convert Russian or English text to Chinese, and using her own imagination to fill in the gaps. She then created new articles to back up her imagined details, which rapidly spiraled out of control. She had 4 other accounts that she used to back up her main account. All Jamal's edits were deleted, and the articles that she'd written alone were taken down. The Jamal hoaxes provided an important reminder that Wikipedia can be a useful introduction to a topic, but it's always important to cross-check information with other reputable sources. For most of human history, there were 5 planets other than Earth that made up the solar system. It was only with the invention of telescopes and other devices that we began to see more than these 5 planets and explore our own solar system in more depth. As more celestial bodies were discovered, scientists began to theorize about what else might be out there, leading to a number of planets, moons, and stars that only existed in the minds of humans. Most of these have been thoroughly debunked, but preserved in Wikipedia's list of hypothetical solar system objects. Most of the objects that make up that list are planets, including the infamous Planet 9, which is theorized to exist beyond the reaches of Neptune. Some of these planets were hypothesized as early as the ancient Greek times. Counter-Earth is one of the oldest hypothetical planets that we now know doesn't exist. Pythagoras believed the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun all orbited an unseen fire at the center of our solar system. The counter-Earth also orbited this fire, but the fire always remained between it and Earth. When the counter-Earth was between the fire and the Moon, its shadow caused a lunar eclipse. Another reason for the belief in the counter-Earth was that it would more evenly balance out the solar system. In modern times, there's been a conspiracy theory that this counter-Earth does exist on the other side of the Sun, but computer models have shown that such a planet couldn't exist without disrupting the orbits of other planets in the inner solar system. Most of the other planets listed on this Wikipedia page were theorized due to mathematical examinations of the solar system. When scientists began to figure out the masses and distances between the planets, they noticed a strange absence between Mars and Jupiter, where they expected a planet to exist. Telescopes returned to this area in search of the theoretical planet, and a number of asteroids were found. Astronomers believed that there had once been a planet which was given the name Phaeton. This was destroyed, possibly due to the influence of other planets or a distant star, or due to a collision with another celestial body. The destruction of Phaeton created the asteroid belt. We know today that rather than being a destroyed planet, the asteroid belt likely exists because Jupiter's gravitational pull stopped a planet from forming in the first place. The most famous entry on the list of hypothetical planets is Planet 9, which is believed to exist beyond Neptune. Like Phaeton, it was first theorized when astronomers discovered their mathematical models didn't line up with reality. The orbits of Uranus and Neptune appeared to be influenced by something beyond. We now know that the discrepancies were caused by Neptune's mass being measured incorrectly. But astronomers still believe there could be something further afield that influences objects in the Kuiper Belt. Other entries on this list include moons of Saturn that were only witnessed once, and a dark star that could be lingering beyond the Oort cloud, which is supposedly responsible for the extinction events on Earth. It's strange to imagine what these alternative solar systems could look like, and a possible future where one or even more of these hypothetical bodies are proven to be real. Jeanne de Clisson earned the nickname of the Lioness of Brittany for her ferocious actions as a pirate during the 100 Years' War. She wasn't motivated by greed or a thirst for power. She wanted revenge on the French king and was as terrifying as possible in order to achieve that. De Clisson's story began as far away from a life of piracy as possible. She was born into a noble family in Brittany and married well. Her husband passed when she was still young, and de Clisson married twice more. Her third husband, Olivier de Clisson, came in 1330. He was a wealthy nobleman, but the marriage wasn't only for political reasons. The two got on well together, and the couple had 5 children. Not long into their marriage, the 100 Years' War began. The conflict between England and France would encompass many smaller wars, including the War of Breton Succession. Taking place in Brittany, this was obviously close to home for the de Clissons, and Olivier de Clisson had to pick sides. Olivier was loyal to the French crown and fought on the side of the House of Blois against the English and Montfort forces. He was one of the commanders in the town of Vannes, which came under siege multiple times. In 1342, the town was finally overwhelmed, and Olivier and the other commanders were captured. Normally, during medieval warfare, noble prisoners would be ransomed back, but in Olivier's case, the English wanted the exchange of prisoners as well. The exchange went ahead, and Olivier returned home to his wife and children. Unfortunately for the de Clissons, that wouldn't be the end of the story. The French king, Philip VI, was obviously worried about his nobles acting against him. For some reason, he came to suspect Olivier and the other barons at Vannes as working with the English. There seems to have been no evidence for this, but later historians wrote of alleged correspondence between the barons and the English nobility. Despite the lack of evidence, the king was convinced of the plot. Olivier and the other barons were arrested and went through a trial. Even without evidence, they were found guilty and were set to lose their lives for the crime. Jean attempted to break her husband out of prison, but was caught before he could escape. That meant she was also now an outlaw. Olivier's punishment went ahead, and his body was put on display as a warning to others who might have thought of acting against the king. Jean took her wealth and raised a force of 400 men. She used this force to attack castles and settlements loyal to the crown. Each time, one person was left as a survivor to carry her message of revenge back to the king. Her most famous acts of revenge would later come on the water. She took her children to England, where she purchased a fleet of warships. These were painted black and had red sails designed to inflict fear from a distance. For 13 years, the Black Fleet would harass merchants and sailors off the coast of Brittany and in the English Channel. De Clisson would only attack French vessels and made sure each time that one person was left alive to bring her message back to the king. Jean de Clisson became one of the most feared names of the time and more than earned her nickname of Lioness of Brittany. But after 13 years, she suddenly retired from her life of piracy and settled down in England, marrying an English noble and living a quiet life far removed from her life of piracy. The word thug entered the English language in the early 19th century, in part due to the actions of one terrifying individual. While he may not be well known today, the man known as Thug Behram was one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Behram was born around 1765 in northern India, and he was apparently a shy child, but that changed when he was introduced to a Thuggee gang. The Thuggees were gangs of criminals who would prey on travelers. The exact origins of the group is something of a mystery, but by the 16th century, they were spread across the Indian subcontinent. The gangs were named after the Sanskrit word for concealment, due to the terrifying nature of their attacks. One or two members of the gang would infiltrate a party of travelers, waiting until they'd gained their trust before calling upon the rest of the gang and attacking them. The Thuggees would take the lives of their victims using a type of ceremonial handkerchief known as a rumal. What made these gangs stand out from typical highwaymen was the cult nature of the attacks. The thugs allegedly believed themselves to be the children of the goddess Kali, who is associated with change, creation, destruction, and death. The thugs weren't simply taking the lives of people in their eyes, they were giving them to Kali. Behram was introduced to one of these groups and quickly rose through the ranks. By the time he was 25, he'd already taken the lives of many individuals. He would soon come up with an innovative way of committing the crimes. He sewed a gold coin or medallion into his handkerchief. When this was pressed against a victim's Adam's apple, it restricted the airways even more. Behram would become one of the most terrifying thugs in the region, earning the nickname King of Thugs and leading his own gang. They would communicate through jackal calls, which would often be the last things victims heard before they were betrayed by members of the gang that had infiltrated their party. Some sources claim that Behram's gang would leave none alive, but others say that he had a code of conduct. No women would be harmed, the Muslim Sufis and people with leprosy would also be spared. During Behram's reign of terror, British rule in India became stronger. British travelers were attacked in the same way that native Indians were, and the authorities aimed to wipe out the threat from Thuggee gangs once and for all. In the 1830s, Captain William Henry Seaman was put in charge of dealing with the threat from Thuggee gangs. He was appointed the superintendent of the Thug Police and set about trying to capture Behram, who was now in his 70s but remained one of the most dangerous people in the country. Multiple investigations failed to capture Behram, so Seaman turned to those closest to him. One of Behram's closest allies was a man named Saeed Amir Ali, who'd been with Behram since he first entered the gang. Seaman managed to capture Ali's family and held them hostage until Ali would become an informant. Ali gave him locations where Behram typically hung out, and it was at one of these that the notorious criminal was finally captured. Exactly how many lives Behram took is unclear. He's said to have witnessed over 900, but how many of those he was directly responsible for is unclear. Barham confessed to taking the lives of 125 people, which alone would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in the world. Said to be one of the inspirations for the dark tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there were definitely two sides to scientist John Hunter. On the one hand, he changed medicine forever with his insistence on experimentation and the scientific method, and made many discoveries that are still significant today. On the other hand, his pursuit of knowledge struck fear in the hearts of people who would later be part of his museum. Hunter was born in 1728 as the 10th child in an ordinary Scottish family. He didn't do well at school, but had a natural curiosity that was difficult to satiate. When he was 20, he moved to London to study under his brother, who was a successful doctor and anatomy teacher. William Hunter's school was one of the most highly regarded in the region, as they always seemed to have a supply of fresh corpses for the students to dissect and study. In a time before X-rays, this was really the only way doctors could learn what was going on inside the human body. John Hunter excelled at dissection, and would soon surpass his brother in terms of both talent and fame. His natural curiosity continued, and he now had the ability to find out the answers for himself. Hunter would conduct experiments to try to learn more about different ailments and their treatments. Whether he experimented on himself or his patients is unclear, but he helped to make advancements in the understanding of various diseases. One of the discoveries he made was that bullets don't poison the area around the wound. When he served as a surgeon in the army, this discovery drastically changed recovery outcomes for many of his patients. He also argued that removing limbs should only be done as a last resort. His reputation meant that he was a doctor to many wealthy individuals, and in 1776, he was appointed as surgeon to King George III. Many of his wealthy clients would come to his home for treatment. It was at this house that the two sides of John Hunter sat side by side. The house was actually two separate houses, joined by a purpose-built lecture theater. One side faced the respectable neighborhood of Leicester Square, and the other side, a shabbier side, faced the Charing Cross Road. On this side of the house, students would lodge, and late at night, the resurrection men would come to visit. In the 1700s, there was no legal way for private anatomy schools to acquire corpses, but it was an important factor for the students' education. William Hunter, and later his brother John, employed the help of so-called resurrection men, or grave robbers. They would bring freshly buried remains from paupers' graveyards. It was something of an open secret, and this is how the surgeons of tomorrow were getting their education. John Hunter became known for paying well for bodies, especially those that were unusual or interesting. Sometimes he sought out those bodies while their owners were still alive. So-called freak shows were popular at the time, and Hunter saw the performers there as potential future specimens. When he heard that a performer was ill, he would be waiting to sweep in and take the body as soon as the person passed away. On 2 occasions, he actually stole the bodies of performers. In 1806, Patrick Cotter O'Brien passed away. Patrick was over 8 feet tall and known as the Bristol Giant. He was scared of his body being dissected after his passing and asked to be buried under 12 feet of concrete. Hunter stole the body before that could happen, but was later forced to return it. Years earlier, a similar thing had happened to Charles Byrne. Charles went by the stage name of the Irish Giant and wished to be buried at sea to stop Hunter or anybody else from getting their hands on his remains. But Hunter bribed a member of the funeral party and stole the body on the way to the coast. Charles was dissected and became part of Hunter's museum. In the same home he shared with his wife and children, Hunter had a museum of over 14,000 human, animal, and plant specimens. After Hunter himself passed away, his collection came into the possession of the Royal College of Surgeons. Many of these specimens are still on display. Charles Byrne's skeleton is still part of the collection, but was removed from the display in 2023. With a lot of historical figures, it's difficult to figure out just how many of their disturbing acts actually happened, and how much of their story is later historians twisting the narrative. That's most often the case with female figures, and is evident in the story of Empress Wu Zetian. It's likely that China's only female ruling emperor committed some horrifying acts on her way to the throne, and when she was ruling the country. But figuring out just how much truth there is to every disturbing story is much harder. Wu was the daughter of a wealthy timber merchant who'd become a close ally of Li Yuan. Shortly before Wu's birth, Li Yuan had overthrown the Sui dynasty and was now ruling as Emperor Gaozu of Tang. Gifts were bestowed on her family, who remained close to Gaozu throughout his reign. When she was still young, Wu entered the imperial palace as a concubine. She was relatively low level and would have had limited interactions with the emperor. One of the people she saw more often, though, was the emperor's son, the future Emperor Taizong. In 626, Gaozu passed away and Taizong took the throne. At the time, it was customary for all the previous emperors' concubines to be confined to a temple and live the rest of their lives as nuns. But Taizong had already taken an interest in Wu, who was much closer to his age than his father's. He would frequently go to visit her at the temple and make comments about how he could get her out of there if he wanted to. Meanwhile, Taizong already had an empress and multiple concubines. His favorite was a woman named Zhao, who had given him multiple children. Taizong's wife, Empress Wei, was jealous of the other woman and encouraged Wu to persuade Taizong to break her out of the temple. The empress had wanted to get rid of Zhao, but all she did was add another rival to the palace. As well as her beauty, Wu was extremely clever and knew how to get what she wanted. She also gave Taizong children. She managed to convince the emperor that his empress had hurt one of the children, and he removed Wang from power. She also had the favored concubine removed from power, so that she was the only person who had Taizong's ear. According to legend, she had the two other women brutally wounded and placed in wine barrels. Once she was at Taizong's side, she wasted no time in increasing her influence. She dealt with nobles and advisors who brutally opposed her. Many lost their lives, while their families also suffered. She would eventually be deposed in 705, a few months before she passed away, and her older son reclaimed the throne. Ever since then, her legacy and story have been manipulated and shrouded in mystery, making the truth hard to distinguish today. In 1987, the documentary film The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On was released. The film follows former soldier Kinzo Okuzaki as he tries to get answers and justice for fellow soldiers who lost their lives during the Second World War. The film sheds light on a disturbing story that Japanese society was trying to ignore. Kinzo Okuzaki was born in 1920 to a family affected by the Great Depression. He had to leave school at 10 and was then drafted at the age of 21 into the military as part of the engineering corps. He spent time first in China, helping to build bridges and roads in occupied territories before he was transferred in 1943 to the newly formed 2nd Company of the 36th Independent Engineering Regiment. At the time, Japan's war effort seemed to be going well. It had acted fast in the opening stages of the Pacific War and took over land and islands across the entire Southwest Pacific. But it wasn't problem-free. In 1942, the Japanese military started a campaign on East New Guinea, which had gone disastrously. The military didn't learn any lessons from the campaign, and in March of 1943, the 18th Army landed on the island. The group included 1,200 soldiers from the 36th Independent Engineering Regiment, one of which was Okuzaki. Okuzaki would later write about his horrifying experience in New Guinea. The engineering regiment was supposed to build an airfield, but even getting to the location was difficult, and many of the soldiers started to suffer from diseases. Even though the airfield was built, it didn't see much use. By now, the Allied forces had control of their air and sea, and the airfield became a target for bombardment. The call eventually came through to abandon the airfield and retreat, first to a base 400 kilometers away, and then to another base 400 kilometers away in Hollandia. The trek was extremely dangerous. The soldiers suffered from a lack of food and tropical diseases. Okuzaki was part of the reconnaissance group, which meant that he had the first access to any food caches they found. It helped him to stay alive, but isolated him from the rest of the group. By the time he made it to Hollandia, he was alone. Only 6 soldiers from the engineering regiment managed to survive New Guinea, including Okuzaki. He surrendered to Allied forces and spent the rest of the war in prison. After the war, Okuzaki tried to adjust to civilian life in Japan and started a car battery company. In 1956, Okuzaki accidentally took the life of a broker and a con man who'd stolen from him and spent 10 years behind bars. Most of that time was spent in solitary confinement, where Okuzaki focused his thoughts on the problems he saw in society. He was angry that the people he saw as responsible for the war didn't pay for their crimes. He saw the emperor system as against the new constitution that had been brought in after the war and damaging to ordinary citizens. He tried to go through legal means to get the matter heard, then turned to other methods. On January 2nd, 1969, Okuzaki fired pachinko balls at Emperor Hirohito during the public opening of the Tokyo Imperial Palace. He didn't want to hurt the emperor severely, and none of the pinballs reached him. He only wanted to draw attention to his cause and question the emperor in court over his actions during the war. Most newspapers dismissed Okuzaki as mentally unwell, and Hirohito didn't testify in court during the assault case. Okuzaki was sentenced to another 1.5 years in prison, but it didn't dampen his need for answers. He would spend the rest of his life confronting military officers and those who had authority during the war, and spent more time in prison after accidentally taking the life of the son of these people. He passed away in 2005 at the age of 85. Ignaz Treibich Lincoln was an extraordinary man who conned and traveled his way across 3 continents in the first half of the 20th century. Figuring out who exactly Treibich Lincoln actually was is far more difficult than looking at who he claimed to be, which may be why this strange historical figure and his story are less well known. Treibich Lincoln was born to an Orthodox Jewish family in Hungary in 1879. He started his life of crime not long after he left school and got into trouble for petty theft. Before he could face the consequences of these crimes, he sold a watch he had stolen from his sister's home and used the money to purchase transport to Britain. It was here where Treibich would reinvent himself for the first time, converting to Christianity and switching between 3 different forms of Protestantism. He managed to get a position doing missionary work in Canada, only to abandon that after a payment dispute. When he returned to England, he got a position as a parish priest, but it's hard to say just how much of his heart was in the job. All accounts of Treibich Lincoln claim that he'd been running con jobs and fraudulent schemes during this time, though it's hard to figure out just what those schemes were. Despite any reputation he might have had, he managed to come into contact with millionaire Seabohm Rowntree and began to work as his private secretary. Rowntree managed to get Treibich Lincoln into politics, an area where he would spend most of his life. He briefly held a seat in the British Parliament but lost the position at the following election. He also had a falling out with Rowntree by now, who discovered some of his friends' fraudulent schemes and wanted nothing to do with it. After a brief detour to the Balkans to attempt to start an oil business, Treibich Lincoln returned to Britain during World War I, where he worked as a censor. But it seems his allegiances lay with Germany, and he worked as a spy for the other nation. He fled to the US to avoid prosecution for espionage, only to then publish a book about his work. It wouldn't have been a surprise for anybody when he was arrested for fraud and sent back to the UK to serve a 3-year prison sentence. By now, Treibich Lincoln had developed a hatred for Britain, which was only made worse by the treaties of Versailles and Trianon, which he saw as unfair to the losing side of the war. Between the wars, he entrenched himself within right-wing politics in Germany and Hungary, but it still didn't seem as if this is where his heart was. He sold documents from the White International Forces, a loose confederation of anti-communists and monarchists that operated around Eastern Europe. That put another target on him, and he was arrested for treason in Austria, but was acquitted. Treibich Lincoln decided that it was time for a fresh start again and traveled to China. While there, he decided to become a Buddhist and quickly rose from monk to abbot. He used his position to gain wealth, as he required all those under him to give him their possessions. It wasn't long before his usual schemes took over, though. He made contact with German representatives in Japan and requested an audience with members of the German government. He wanted to try to convince them to end the war and intended to use his newfound mystical prowess to do so. The meeting never happened, and Treibich Lincoln's ties with the German government came to a swift end. King Ferdinand I of Naples ruled his kingdom for a little over 35 years. During that time, he became known as a patron of the arts and for completing numerous building projects. But he was also constantly at war and fighting off rivals for the throne. That led to a disturbing museum being created, where Ferdinand could take any potential threats to dissuade them. Italy during the 1400s was already a volatile place with many kingdoms, cities, and papal states all battling one another for power. Ferdinand's father, Alfonso V, had already had to fight for the throne and wasn't the direct descendant of any of his predecessors. That meant there would already have been a lot of people trying to get the kingdom back after Alfonso passed away. Ferdinand's succession was further complicated by the fact that he'd been born illegitimate, the son of Alfonso's mistress. Ferdinand had been taken in by his father and trained in the arts of politics and war. He was also legitimized and had the backing of 2 of the previous popes. But when it came to Ferdinand's coronation, things weren't as simple as had been hoped. There were multiple other claimants to the throne, and the new pope was not as welcoming of Ferdinand as the previous popes. Through political maneuvering and battles, Ferdinand managed to secure the throne, but his reign would not be problem-free. He made social laws that favored artisans and peasants, which in turn limited the power of his barons. In 1485, this led to a complete revolt, with barons taking over territory owned by the king and capturing one of Ferdinand's sons. They had the backing of the Pope, which only made fighting them more difficult. After months of battle, Ferdinand formed an alliance with Florence and Milan, finally quashing the revolution. Many of the barons and other rebels lost their lives after Ferdinand took back control, but the king still wanted revenge. He offered the remaining rebels amnesty and tricked them out of their stronghold. For a short while, it looked as if the whole event had been put behind them. The leaders of the conspiracy were the Count of Sarno and Antonello Petrucci, Ferdinand's secretary. They both managed to survive, but that would quickly change when they were both arrested at a wedding held for the children of the other counts. Others were also arrested and faced the rest of their lives in prison before having their lives taken. With so many enemies, it's not clear exactly when Ferdinand came up with the idea that he thought would best frighten anybody else into thinking of going against him. But at some point during his many fights to stay in control of his kingdom, he created what he would call the Black Museum. Ferdinand would have the bodies of his enemies embalmed and mummified, then dressed in their everyday outfits, and these mummies were then posed in various scenes in his macabre museum. If the king thought that someone was making plans to commit treason, he would simply take that individual on a guided tour of his museum, showing off what had happened to the last people who had gone against him. Zheng Yi Sao was one of the most fearsome and successful pirates in history. She ran a confederation of between 40,000 and 60,000 soldiers and had hundreds of ships at her command. Operating between 1801 and 1810, she terrorized the Chinese authorities and anybody trying to do trade in the South China Sea, then retired for a quiet life in Guangdong. Around the year 1800, piracy in the South China Sea started to become more organized. What had once been something fishermen took part in during the off-season had become a full-time operation. Thousands of former fishermen had taken part in the Tay Son Wars in Vietnam, earning warfare experience and money to make a pirate life their full-time occupation. For a while, many of these different pirate fleets fought one another for supremacy, which allowed the Chinese government and European traders in the area to slip through. Eventually, they came together to form the Guangdong Pirate Confederation, led by Zheng Yi. Zheng Yi was part of a pirate family and at the head of the Red Flag Fleet and hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors under his command. In 1801, he married a woman named Shi Yang, who would then take on the name Zheng Yi Sao. Zheng Yi Sao was a competent businesswoman who had the skills to make the new Federation of Pirates a success. At this time, there was a lot of trade going on in the South China Sea, and every ship had to pass through the Federation's territory. If they wanted to pass through without being attacked, they had to pay a fee to the Federation, who would then issue passports to let other pirates know that this ship wasn't to be touched. Anybody that didn't pay the fee would be boarded and attacked. Lower-level sailors could escape with their lives, but anybody who worked for the government or military would meet a horrifying fate. In 1807, Zheng Yi passed away after going overboard in a storm. There was a possibility that the entire Federation would collapse without his leadership, but Zheng Yi Sao took the reins. For added authority, she married Zheng Yi's adopted son, Zhang Bao, who had become a successful pirate in his own right. With Zheng Yi Sao now at the helm, the Pirate Confederation went from success to success. She reformed the rules to become much harsher against pirates who disobeyed their superiors, or those that hurt captives. She also organized the distribution of the treasure that the Confederation captured, making sure everybody got a cut of the money. The Confederation was now stronger than ever, but also a bigger problem for the Chinese government. They tried to work with Portuguese ships to blockade Zheng Yi Sao, but she was able to make an escape with her personal fleet. But Zheng Yi Sao and the other pirates knew their success wouldn't last forever. By 1810, the government came up with a new way to rid itself of the pirate problem. They would simply pay pirates to retire. Some had already begun to break away from the Federation, adding to the competition, and Zheng Yi Sao knew her advantageous negotiating position wouldn't last for long. She managed to make a deal to retain a small fleet of ships and sailors to run a legal business, and lived until the age of 69. Maximilian Robespierre is one of the most controversial and divisive figures in history. He's known for presiding over the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, but he could also be considered one of the driving forces that kept the revolution alive. Robespierre began his career as a lawyer, arguing against capital punishment. He had some progressive views for the time period and spoke on topics such as the poor treatment of illegitimate children and women in academic spaces. He was elected as a representative for the Third Estate and the Estates General, a parliament that had no real power. It wasn't long after Robespierre was elected that the French Revolution began in earnest. He became an important political figure as various governmental bodies replaced one another during a time of chaos. He continued to make progressive arguments about equality under the law and all men in the country getting a vote, but all the while he was becoming more and more radical. Robespierre was part of the Jacobin Club, an anti-monarchy political organization that wanted to take the revolution to extremes. After the king was captured, there was a debate about what to do with him. Some simply wanted to exile the royal family, while others wanted him to remain in prison. Despite arguing against capital punishment before, Robespierre argued that the king should not live if the revolution was to survive. The king wouldn't be the last person that Robespierre sent to the guillotine. It soon became clear, to him at least, that there were more people who would bring about the end of the revolution if they were allowed to live. His political enemies were often the target of these campaigns, but ordinary citizens were also feeling the consequences of the Reign of Terror. People who thought the Jacobin Club was going too far would often find themselves arrested. Expressing fear about the current situation could be labeled as thinking anti-revolutionary thoughts, and they could get a citizen in trouble with the so-called Committee for Public Safety. Another area where Robespierre went against his former arguments concerned the right to trial. Many people who were arrested would never get any trial at all. The trials that did take place could not be considered fair trials. Thousands of people lost their lives during the Reign of Terror. Many would pass away in prison due to the horrendous conditions there, while many more met a more gruesome end. Robespierre's reign could only last a couple of years before he would finally be brought down. He'd handed out punishments to even those revolutionaries who'd once been his close friends, and everyone in the French government knew that they were no longer safe. In July of 1794, he warned that there was a conspiracy against the revolution and against him. He claimed that there were members of the National Convention who were part of the conspiracy. Whether or not he knew about a genuine conspiracy is unclear, but the National Convention acted quickly. The following day, Robespierre and his remaining allies were arrested, and days later he would lose his life in the same manner as many of his own enemies. There are few more horrifying figures from history than Tamerlane, the first ruler of the Timurid dynasty. The conqueror was feared by nobility and peasants alike, and few crossed him who would live. It's not clear whether Tamerlane was the descendant of the infamous Genghis Khan himself, or simply the descendant of a cousin, but Tamerlane definitely took after the more famous Mongol leader in terms of his backstory. From an early age, Timur showed leadership skills and a willingness to play outside the rules. He led a band of other youths to raid travelers of goods and animals. Even before his rise to power, he was causing fear for those who traveled through the area where he and his family lived. A young Timur also showed skill with weapons and worked as a mercenary and then a military leader in southern Persia. At some point in the 1360s, Timur would gain the wounds that earned him the nickname Timur the Lame, and then Tamerlane. Some sources claim that he'd been stealing from a shepherd when he was struck with arrows that left him permanently disabled. Others say that he received the wounds while acting as a mercenary. Whichever was the case, he suffered damage to his right leg and hand and would never fully recover. It wasn't long into his adulthood that he started to look to gain power for himself. The instability of the area, which was constantly battling with its neighbors, meant that Tamerlane could gain power by allying with various claimants and supporting them in their conquest. He then started to carve out space for himself, using the people he put in power as figureheads. By the 1370s, Tamerlane was ruling in his own right and looking to expand his empire. He fought against his former brother-in-law and friend, defeating him and taking over the land he'd helped the other man conquer. He spread his influence in all directions, using both his connection to Genghis Khan and his religion to try to influence people. He claimed that he was fighting on behalf of God, but that didn't stop him from attacking and ruining some of the most significant cities in the Islamic world. When a city showed him resistance, there was little hope of survival for those inside. There are countless stories of Tamerlane giving his soldiers a quota of the number of skulls they had to collect. They were then piled up in towers outside the city as a warning of what would happen if anybody else tried to resist. He left behind a legacy as one of the scariest individuals in history, who may have caused the passing of over 1 million people, but he started a dynasty that ruled for hundreds of years. The subject of parasites can be a frightening and repulsive topic. Parasites are living organisms that require a host for survival. They feed, grow, and multiply with the help of a host. There are different types of these organisms, some of which directly harm the host, and others that just live off of them. Examples include the tongue-eating louse that replaces a fish's tongue, or the notorious cordyceps fungus that completely takes over the host's body. The idea of parasitism appealed to fictional writers so much that the organisms would often be included in some form or another. The Wikipedia page Parasites in Fiction lies host to the concept used in fictional works in the form of novels or sci-fi movies. According to the page, authors and even scriptwriters have exploited the biology of parasitism, which includes behavior-altering parasites, brood parasites, and various forms of vampires. The most infamous of fictional freeloaders include Count Dracula and the xenomorphs from the Alien franchise. Accompanying the context of the page is a 2011 painting done by Katrin Alvarez, which captures the nature of parasitism. A sullen figure stands to the far left as various leecher-type organisms connect to his mind through ribbon-like strings. The use of parasitism in fiction dates back to 19th century novels, including Beetle in the 1897 novel The Beetle, written by Richard Marsh. This book follows the horrors unleashed by a shape-shifting ancient Egyptian entity that seeks revenge on a British Parliament member. We also find Bram Stoker's novel Dracula mentioned here. Dracula starts out as a human host, welcoming guests into his home, prior to revealing his vampiristic and parasitic nature. Also mentioned here is The Parasite, written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This time, the book makes use of a mind-controlling organism, similar to that of animal magnetism of the Victorian era, a concept invented by a German doctor. In this case, mind control only works on certain hosts but not on others. Tapeworms are a very real parasite in the real world, but what if they could actually control our minds? The concept was brought forth in another novel titled Parasite by Myra Grant. Not only was the idea of moochers, leechers, and hanger-ons being represented in novels, but it's also made its way into horror films and video games. The Wikipedia page also tabulated a few of the accounts in which parasites appear in fiction. The table was separated into 7 columns: author, work, medium, date, parasite effect, and biological counterpart. The summary included David Cronenberg's Shivers, in which a genetically engineered parasite appears. Filth by Irvine Welsh speaks of a talking tapeworm. As horrifying as fictional organisms are, Wikipedia goes on to explain why reality is so much worse. It cites parasitic wasps that lay their eggs in living caterpillars. Of course, by the end of the egg stage, there would be no happy ending for the host. The alien xenomorph begins its life as a large egg planted in a human host, which rapidly grows and erupts from the host's chest. This sort of egg to adult stage is present in real life as well, and can be observed through flatworms. Not only this, but biologists have also discovered that the egg, parented by a living host, can acquire some of their genes. Cordyceps serve as an example of this. Nicknamed the zombie plant, the fungus is able to take control of the host's brain, forcing it to do whatever it wants. Other examples include the emerald jewel wasp that creates subservient puppets out of cockroaches, or the barnacle-like crustaceans that penetrate the crab's brain, forcing it to care for barnacle young. The page also details the various types of parasites that have also been mentioned in fiction, revealing an unnerving truth to sci-fi novels and film. Wikipedia has an incredibly detailed overview of the confessions and aftermath of Isabelle Gowdie, a 1600s Scottish woman. The story begins with a background of this period, which saw the Scottish courts and acts of witchcraft coming together. In 1550, witch hunts had begun with the Parliament of Mary, Queen of Scots, passing the Scottish Witchcraft Act just a few years after. This brought into practice capital punishment for practitioners of witchery. A written work detailed demonology was completed by James, son of Mary, following his involvement with the North Berwick trials, as well as the Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1597. From 1661 to 1662, another great witch hunt ensued, and was believed to be the last and most severe of prosecutions. According to historian Emma Wilby, Isabelle, a dabbler in the occult, may have been one of the 7 witches who was apprehended and tried in Aldern amid this hunt. Unfortunately, there's no records of Isabelle's life prior to being wedded to John Gilbert, and her age has been left undetermined. Isabelle is also one of the only supposed witches to have given confessions without being subjected to torture. She would go on to make 4 whole confessions over a mere 6 weeks, with the first dated to 1662. It's not known, according to Wikipedia, why she came forward in the first place, or why she told her prosecutors so much without being threatened. During her first confession, Isabelle detailed something quite alarming. It was an encounter with the devil, whom she had arranged to meet one evening at Aldern. During this confession, she would also incriminate other women who supposedly attended the meeting as well. The devil was described as a cloven-hooved man who occasionally wore boots. She also alluded to grave robbing, crop spoiling, locations of covens, and the location at which they all danced. It was also discovered that John Gilbert, Isabelle's husband, had no knowledge of her witchcraft involvement. In fact, in the evenings, she would place a broom beside him so that he wouldn't notice her absence. The coven, according to the confessions, would eat the best types of food at houses that were only reachable by magical horses. The coven would also be entertained by the Queen of Elfame at her home at Downey Hill. It's noted that in various parts of her confessions, Isabelle would be interrupted by notaries, deeming these parts as etc., which was thought to be irrelevant. Her second confession took place on the 3rd of May that same year. This time, she gave further details about the coven that she was involved in and provided the nicknames of its members. Isabelle claimed that she was able to turn into various animals, including a cat and a horse. Wikipedia additionally added one of the chants, which in this case would turn one into a hare. And it said, "I shall go into a hare with sorrow and such and mickle care, and I shall go in the devil's name, while I come home again." At least another 26 such chants would be given, which is much more than any other witchcraft case in history. The third confession took place on the 15th of May, during which Isabelle recalled pacts that she made with the devil. After the Aldern Kirk meetup, she alleged that while disguised as a hare, she was sent on an errand, during which she was chased by a pack of dogs that would bite her. The fourth and final confession of Isabelle took place just days later, which only confirmed her previous testimonies. 41 people were arrested as a result of her confessions. The online encyclopedia also found no record of the execution of Isabelle Gowdie. This confession served as an influence in the music and art of the times. It was also the case that found itself sparking many folk tales and myriad ballads such as the Elfin Knight. While it was deduced by various media outlets, including Wikipedia, that these confessions were voluntary, it's also noted that beating, sleep deprivation, and being pricked for the witch's mark were not considered torture at the time. parasites aren't the only thing creeping their way onto Wikipedia and into the human brain. One page holds an odd phenomenon that highlights the intelligence that cephalopods possess. While the name Octopolis and Octlantis sounds fictional, mythical, and fantastical, they are very much real. These two non-human settlements can be found in Jervis Bay, situated on the coast of New South Wales. In 2009, a bed of scallop shells forming an ellipse and measuring 2 to 3 meters in diameter was discovered. It was dubbed Octopolis and is an octopus-built and inhabited settlement that boasts a singular piece of scrap metal. Octopuses are known to build dens for themselves by burrowing into a shell bed, which is what they've done here at Octopolis. The shells are far better den-building material than the fine sand that surrounds the site. 14 octopuses have been seen at this cephalopod commune at a single time. Then a nearby, possibly rival city popped up a few years later. In 2016, a similar-looking settlement, this time dubbed Octlantis by biologists, was discovered and is believed to house around 14 octopuses as well. Both of these settlements are inhabited by the gloomy octopus. This is a common cephalopod in Sydney, and they're known to inhabit the subtropical waters. Octopolis and Octlantis are characterized by the multiple burrows that adorn the concentrated areas, which are reinforced by not only shells, but also anthropogenic materials. Given the incredible intelligence that we know octopuses exhibit, it's easy to imagine a complex, vast shared habitat, but instead this bustling neighborhood was an unconscious choice created by the resources available at Jervis Bay. The scallop shells were the remains of foraging oceanic creatures. It's believed that over the years, the more scallop shells that were left will accumulate and provide even more den-building material, which will ultimately lead to more octopuses and an unusually concentrated living circumstance. This cumulative effort of animals actively altering their environment is known as ecological engineering, with only a handful of creatures serving as examples. The discovery of these two sites is incredibly important, unusual, and slightly concerning. It's known that octopuses are solitary animals, so this interaction is seen as particularly unique. Despite numerous observations and studies, what led to the creation of the settlements isn't clear. Residents of Octopolis and Octlantis find that these urban areas are a tough place to live. While food and company are abundant, there's also an abundance of predators. There also appears to be an unnatural amount of aggression between the communities, and researchers aren't sure why. Aside from the vast information Wikipedia offers about the settlements, it also gave us a look into cephalopod intelligence and how they're able to learn, especially in terms of tool use, which may be an alarming adaptation. The Valley of Drums is a title that sounds daunting, and the story that goes along with it certainly is. While it's officially known as the A.L. Taylor Superfund site, the Valley of Drums became the widely used title when referring to this 23-acre area. The valley isn't filled with greenery, shrubs, wildflowers, and fauna as one may initially suspect, but is rather a historical site strewn with drums containing toxic waste. The area is near Brooks, Kentucky. The accumulation of waste-filled drums is of course what gave the area its name. The containers have been collected in this area since the 1960s. It wasn't until 19 years later, though, that the United States Environmental Protection Agency decided to analyze the situation on the property, as well as the nearby creek. What they discovered was something truly alarming. High levels of PCBs and heavy metals, along with another 140 chemicals, were found. PCBs refer to a group of man-made chemicals that take on an oily or solid form. They're either clear or yellow in color and have no taste or smell. PCBs have been linked to many health conditions, including liver damage, skin conditions, and thyroid dysfunction. It was this situation that led to the Superfund Act of 1980. While the Love Canal disaster is often credited with the establishment of this act, activist Lois Gibbs concluded that Love Canal looked like a suburban community in comparison with the valley in terms of visualizing the issue. Prior to the EPA investigation, though, state officials were only drawn to the valley when a few of the drums had caught fire and burned for more than a week in 1966. But during this period, no laws addressed the storage of toxic fumes, so the site was left unregulated. Then in 1977, the primary owner of the valley and the primary dumper, A.L. Taylor, passed away. No records revealed who owned the property thereafter, with tax records indicating that property taxes hadn't been paid for many years. In 1978, still prior to the EPA investigation, the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Protection investigated the property, only to find that there were more than 100,000 drums of waste delivered to this area. 27,000 of these drums were buried in the soil, possibly even leaking out and contaminating nearby land. The remainder of the containers were dropped into pits or trenches. As the site was left unregulated, the metallic drums began to deteriorate, which meant that its contents would be spilling into the ground. From there, they were flushed by rains into a nearby creek, causing a foul odor and frequent complaints by nearby property owners who were inhaling the toxic fumes. After the EPA carried out the investigation, an immediate emergency cleanup was initiated. This cleanup, though, only focused on the worst leaking drums. Workers soon realized the extent of this issue, and it drew beyond their abilities. It didn't take long for the issue at the Valley of the Drums to become publicized. 3 years after the investigation, another cleanup was initiated and went on for 7 more years. In 2003, an environmental audit found PCBs in the sediment and ordered more testing. In 2008, the EPA sent inspectors to the Valley of Drums only to discover at least 4 dozen rusted drums strewn across the land, some of which spread into the Jefferson Memorial Forest. It was found that these drums were lying beyond the dump site, which was fenced in the 80s. That year, new cleanups were being considered, but to this day, drums still lay hazardly across the land. There's no doubt that twin siblings are more of a common occurrence than many of us think. But it takes a special and eerie set of siblings to be awarded their very own personal Wikipedia page. June and Jennifer Gibbons were born on the 11th of April in 1963. It certainly came as a shock to the Caribbean immigrants, Gloria and Aubrey, when they were left with another 2 daughters instead of 1. The family moved from Barbados to the UK in the early 60s. The couple had 3 children prior, including David, Greta, and Rosie. In 1974, the family decided to relocate again to Wales. It was soon realized that June and Jennifer were inseparable, and their sped-up Creole language made them hard to understand. Given that they were the only children of color in their school, the sisters were regularly ostracized. This was, of course, traumatic for them. Later in life, the 2 girls fell silent, only communicating with one another. This awarded them the nickname the Silent Twins. The reason for their silence, though, was more heartbreaking than it seemed. Initially, the twins were seen as an example of cryptophagia, a derived language only known to a pair, a characterization that was disputed by June. In 2023, she explained that the reason for not speaking was because their parents couldn't understand them due to a speech impediment, so they decided to stop talking. This issue wasn't unique to home life and affected both sisters at school. While they continued to further their education, they both refused to read and write. In 1974, a medic came to the school and administered vaccines. He noticed the impassive behavior and decided to engage with a child psychologist. After having seen a number of therapists, June and Jennifer were separated and placed into different boarding schools. But this would initiate a series of eerie events. Almost immediately, the girls became catatonic. After having been reunited, they withdrew to their bedroom and created elaborate plays using their dolls. As they continued to age, the pair began their writing careers together, and each kept an extensive diary of poetry, stories, and potential novels. They created various works, some of which are still available for purchase today, including The Pugilist, Discomania, and The Pepsi-Cola Addict, and more. As they stepped into their young adulthood lives, the twins would begin partaking in the use of narcotics, setting them on a dangerous road. Together, they committed various criminal acts, including vandalism, theft, and even arson. These acts would lead them to be admitted to the Broadmoor Hospital, the mental health hospital. They were sentenced to indefinite detention. For 11 years, the 2 remained there, which they blamed for their selective muteness. In the hospital, it was alleged that Jennifer had developed tardive dyskinesia due to medications and confinement. The story took an even darker turn when just 1 day prior to their release, Jennifer began to act oddly. Her speech was slurred, and she slept on June's lap with her eyes open. Upon arriving at their destination, though, Jennifer couldn't be roused and was later found to have succumbed to acute myocarditis. Just days later, June would claim that she was liberated and that it felt as though a tsunami was washing over her, and that she felt finally free from her sister. There's still so much for us to discover about the world. Sometimes, though, even with experts leading the investigation into new discoveries, questions still abound. This is true for the Paleodictyon nodosum, a living creature that continues to puzzle scientists. In 1976, unusual-looking burrows were discovered on the Galapagos Rift. The burrow they produce looks exactly like the Paleodictyon fossils. While scientists have collected many of the burrows, no one has actually seen this creature alive. Its appearance remains widely debated today, with only theories detailing its possible structure. Adolf Seilaker, the man who originally discovered the fossils of the creatures, wondered if they took on a worm-like form. He suggested that this worm would burrow into the sediment of hydrothermal vents, deflecting the water flow around them in an effort to catch or farm food. Peter A. Rona, the scientist who discovered the modern-day burrows, believes that the Paleodictyon nodosum is a large protist, something akin to red algae, kelp, slime mold, amoeba, and more. This is evidence that protists can reach the site of the Paleodictyon and are known to be benthic organisms. Later, these two scientists embarked on a mission together, using the DSV Alvin submersible. They were able to collect samples of the same form. The samples appeared in similar conditions to those found on the Galapagos Rift. These burrows are the only items of the creatures that scientists can actually study, since the creatures that create them remain elusive. The top of the burrow takes a shield shape with a raised center and an outer lip. The center rises around 5 millimeters above the lowest point of the structure. Strangely, while inhabited, the surface becomes red due to metalliferous sediment. When not vacant, it becomes light gray with a flattened top. The red sediment found on the burrow only occurs beneath the surrounding surface, suggesting a biotic factor. It was discovered that the burrows are the result of organic growth. One hypothesis supported by Seilaker argues that these burrows are the trace fossils of the aforementioned worms. The structure also had multiple exits, which is not unheard of in the animal kingdom. One such example that supports Seilaker's theory is the leafcutter ant, which cultivates its own food and forms tunnels. The second idea, supported by Rona, is the sponge theory. He believes that the structures were left by a sea sponge, with the supposed burrow really being a cast of the creature's body. Through testing, though, evidence that both supports the theory and debunks it was found. According to fossil records, these types of burrows are the earliest examples of complex structures seen in the animal kingdom. The older fossils of the Paleodictyon nodosum burrows show less hexagonal uniformity, but over time they became more consistent and precise, taking on a honeycomb appearance. Despite the significant research that has gone into the fossils and burrows, not much is known about the creature itself, and it remains undiscovered, while its habitat has littered the ocean. One of the most brutal animal wars known to man has been brought to Wikipedia in an extensive article that details the entire ordeal. It was the Gombe Chimpanzee War, also known as the 4-Year War, observed by Jane Goodall. Prior to the battle, primates lived in communities at the Gombe Stream Research Center, located in Kakombe Valley. It was known as the perfect primate research opportunity, and Goodall took advantage of it. Chimpanzees were among the primates of the park. They roamed the hills in territorial communities consisting of 1 to 40 members. The Kasakela area was one of 3 areas dedicated to research, with Kakombe in the center and Mekenke in the south. Goodall was following one community of chimps known as the Kasakela group. She observed their feeding situation, noting apparent aggressive territorial behavior. The males would patrol their area, occasionally raiding other groups. They would often perform isolated attacks on the infants and females. Usually, male chimps would avoid each other or resort to noisy displays instead of physical attacks. Goodall, though, didn't see the conflict coming between the two groups. Initially, the group was unified under the Kasakela community, but Goodall noticed splintering in the community. After 8 months, there was a clear divide, and the second troop, the Kahama Chimos, was named. Kahama was composed of 6 adult males and 3 females with their young, while the opposition was left with 8 adult males and 12 females with their young. The conflict between the two chimp groups emerged at the end of the reign of the Kasakela Alpha, Mike's term. Over a few months, the hostility between two communities increased. While the more northern group, Kasakela, made a point of staying out of the southern zone, the southerners, led by Charlie and Hai, would make forays into the opposing territory. The joint force were brothers who displayed a fearless nature. Despite the growing tensions though, Mike and Rudolph maintained peace with a southern male named Goliath. The war commenced in 1974 when 6 adults from Kasakela decided to ambush an isolated male from Kahama. He'd been feeding on a nearby tree. Despite his attempt to flee, the other chimps seized him. After their victory, the group celebrated with hoots and screeches. After they were treated, he stood up again but would later succumb to his injuries. This attack marked the first time that any chimpanzees had initiated an attack on a fellow chimp. The Kasakela troops' brutal assault didn't end there. They would go on to attack D, this time with the help of a female named Gigi. The third victim was the elderly Goliath, who had once maintained peace with them. Eventually, there were only 3 Kahama males left, including Sniff, Charlie, and Willy Wally, who had polio. Charlie would become the next victim, and then Willy Wally vanished, leaving the young Sniff on his own. He survived for just over a year. 3 females were kidnapped by the Kasakela community, while others vanished. This conflict took place over 4 years, during which all Kahama males were wiped up, effectively disbanding the troop. Kasakela chimps expanded their territory, but were successfully repelled by 2 other chimp communities. The war was found to be one of the most brutal attacks led by animals. It was a heart-wrenching ordeal observed by Goodall and other primatologists. It's one animal-driven event that echoed human conflict. North Main Street, Tonopah, Nevada, America's scariest motel. The Clown Motel is a clown-themed motel that lies adjacent to the Tonopah Cemetery. It's the burial ground of the original owner's father. In 1985, the 33-room inn was opened by Leroy and Leona David. This was in honor of their late father, Clarence David. The owners made use of Clarence's 150 clown statue collection to decorate the property. Then in 1995, it was taken over by Bob Perchetti, who operated it for another 22 years. In 2017, the property was placed on sale for $900,000 and was purchased 2 years later. The Clown Motel was owned by Vijay Mehar, who appointed his family friend and former art director, Hame Anand, as the CEO. Hame not only gave the motel a facelift, but created a new identity for it as the world's famous clown motel. Over the years, more clown statues and other memorabilia came to take up residency at the inn. By the time Vijay had purchased it, there were around 600 clown statues there. This, under the direction of Haim, drastically increased to more than 4,000 clown-dedicated memorabilia. 2 of the new installations included jolly clown cutouts that stood 19 feet tall. These 2 clowns stood imposingly, threatening hospitality to visitors and onlookers. The rooms of the motel were also themed, which included The Exorcist, It, and Friday the 13th. These spooky designs forced chills and shivers among guests, leading it to be named America's scariest motel. As the clown memorabilia grew, so did the crowd, which placed the attraction on the world map. It's also this inn that is the go-to for ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, filmmakers, clown lovers, and spook enthusiasts. Adding to the allure and creepiness of the Clown Motel is the cemetery next door. It was founded in 1901 and closed just 10 years later. Eerily, among the buried are victims of the Tonopah Plague and the 9/11 Belmont mine fire. Also taking up a spot in the burial ground is Sheriff Thomas Logan, whose effort to save individuals at a nearby brothel led to his demise. The first African-American man to have stepped foot in Tonopah, George Davis, has also been placed here. In 2015, a paranormal enthusiast brought his crew along to the Clown Motel for the last episode of Ghost Adventures. The scenes of the episode included a sighting of a creepy dark figure, a voice saying, "Hello, it turned on," and the famous footage of a large clown moving its hand entirely of its own accord. That same year, a writer stayed in the motel and said that he wanted to experience the supernatural for himself, and that he did. even turning his experience into a comic book titled I Lived in a Clown Motel, a true story of the dumbest thing I ever did. Many people become terrified when staying in the hotel, so much so that it's become a test of bravery. The collection of clowns, though, is ever growing, with people from all over the world sending their memorabilia to the inn. What initially appeared to be just like any other small village dedicated Wikipedia page actually held a nightmarish story. The South Badley page not only provides a very brief history of the small village, but also presents the story of the groaning tree. South Badley is a small village that finds itself comfortably nestled in the civil parish of Boulder, located in the New Forest National Park of Hampshire. Lymington is the nearest town, which lies 2.3 miles away. Instead of a comprehensive history of the village, the South Badley Wikipedia page speaks of a nearby pub, the Red Lion. The pub was named after a local folklore legend of a creature known as the Stratford Lion, a supposed giant red lion with yellow eyes, stag-like antlers, a wild mane, and penetrating teeth. The legend states that John Stratford yanked this peculiar lion from the ground in a nearby wooded area named Haresmead. This allegedly took place in the 14th century. Sightings of the ghastly monster have been reported as early as the 18th century, and as recently as the 20th. But the Stratford Lion is not the most alarming aspect of this page. The groaning tree of Badley is also mentioned here. The page details how a local author, William Gilpin, spoke of the history of the groaning tree. Gilpin explained that in the year 1750, a local South Badley farmer heard a sound coming from behind his house. The sound was frequent and mimicked that of a person in agony. His bedridden wife was alarmed by the sounds, and he tried his best to convince her that it was just the noise of stags in the forest. The truth was, though, that all the neighbors were hearing it, and all were growing fearful. After some investigation, the farmer discovered that this alarming noise was actually coming from a nearby elm tree. In a matter of a few weeks, news of the story reached far and wide. People came from all over to listen to the screaming tree, and many explanations were offered. Theories referred to both the natural and supernatural, but no definite answer was found. For 18 to 20 months, the agonizing screams emitted from the elm tree until the owner of the home decided to bore a hole into its trunk. The groans stopped, but the tree still stood there for many years, never groaning again. Eventually, it was uprooted with the intention of investigating the screams that once came from it. Still, nothing unusual was found. Later, it would be universally believed that there was no superstitious trick at play here, but that there was a perfectly natural cause that was never understood. Wikipedia often finds itself presenting unique and fascinating categories. Cephalophores are among such varieties. While it may sound like yet another oceanic creature, cephalophores refer to a different community entirely. The online encyclopedia warned that a cephalophore should not be confused with headless priest, an entirely separate Wikipedia discussion. Instead, the term, which comes from the Greek word meaning head carrier, is used to describe a saint who's often depicted as carrying a severed head. Some may have noticed the decapitated martyrs, Victoricus and Gentian, at the western entrance of the Amiens Cathedral. Various statues have been created and litter the world's museums. They're saints of the severed heads. Occasionally, a halo will make its way into the portrayal, occupying the space where the head used to be. The depictions and concepts of cephalophores stem from strange origins and folklore. Two sources were discovered when trying to track down the possible origins of the word. One of them comes from a sermon on two saints, Juventinus and Maximum. An archbishop of Constantinople expressed that the severed head was far more terrifying to the devil when it was able to speak. One of the most famous cephalophores is Denis, the patron saint of Paris. According to the legend, this saint had preached with his own head in his hands as he journeyed 7 miles from Montmartre. Denis was en route to his own burial grounds, and while he's the most well-known head carrier, one folklorist, Émile Nouret, found no less than another 134 examples in French literature alone. Another cephalophoric legend refers to Nicasius. The story tells of the saint reading Psalm 119 as his execution was underway. Upon uttering the words, "My soul clings unto dust," the execution concluded. As the saint's head fell to the ground, Nicasius continued uttering the psalm. The theme of a talking severed head hopped its way into the 18th century, with the legend of Saint Justus from Beauvais. In this tale, Roman soldiers beheaded him, and when his father and brother came to find him, they discovered that the corpse was sitting, head in his lap. His head was handed to the father, and Justus asked him to take it to his mother. Aphrodisius of Alexandria was inserted into the list of bishops. While accompanied by his camel, Aphrodisius preached to a crowd as his executors made their way through, severing his head. But this was no worry for the bishop, as he simply retrieved it and took it to the chapel. While most of the cephalophore descriptions refer to men, there were times in which women would somehow live just long enough to retrieve their heads and hurry to a place of rest. One such tale came from Saint Osgith, who stood up following her execution, taking her head and collapsing at the door of a local convent. The legend of cephalophores is certainly alarming and serves as a creepy story behind the artistic depictions seen in many museums. When one hears the sentence pigeon photography, you may be expecting to find an album full of the best captured images of pigeons. But the real explanation behind this term is stranger than that. Pigeons have served humanity since the 5th century BC, when they became used as the first messengers. For decades, they served as a vital warning method and probably saved many lives. But it turns out that this wasn't the only thing that the birds aided in. According to a Wikipedia page, misleadingly titled Pigeon Photography, they were actually used in an aerial photography technique. This technique was deployed in 1907 by the German apothecary Julius Neubronner. He'd been using pigeons to deliver medications prior to this invention. He fitted a tame homing pigeon with an aluminum harness attached to a miniature time delay camera. Initially, the apothecary's patent application was rejected. He later produced some authentic pictures taken by the pigeons, which granted his patent in December of 1908. So the page wasn't dedicated to a trove of pigeon pictures, but rather one dedicated to aerial images taken by the birds. In 1909, Julius published the technique and even sold some of the images as postcards, and then the military stepped in. They saw this method of aerial photography as a military potential for aerial reconnaissance. During the First World War, pigeons attached with cameras were sent to the skies and showed some encouraging results. Julius later abandoned his experiments, and the interest in pigeon photography used in the military soon dwindled. In the 1930s, the idea was resurrected by a Swiss clockmaker named Christian Adrian Mitchell, who used the method in the Swiss Army carrier pigeon service. The German and French militaries also made use of the technique during the wars. World War II rolled around, and the war pigeons were deployed again, although it's unclear to what extent they were used or if they were in fact used for aerial surveillance activities. The French army claimed that they created film cameras for the flying photographers, and even developed a method of having the flock released by training dogs once they were behind enemy lines. The United States Central Intelligence Agency later grabbed hold of this technique as well. They developed a battery-powered camera that could be secured to an espionage pigeon. So the invention went from an innocent technique of aerial photography to war pigeons being exploited for espionage activities. The details of the espionage pigeons' involvement with the CIA, though, remains classified. The CIA's spy pigeon is now displayed at the CIA Museum, along with his attached camera. Pigeons are often degradingly referred to as rats with wings, but people are unaware of the rich history they hold and the extent to which they've aided humanity. The list of animals awarded human credentials Wikipedia page is exactly what you think it is. It's a list of animals that have been awarded with human credentials. Wikipedia specified that this list includes non-human animals that have been submitted as applicants to diploma mills. These listed animals were in fact awarded diplomas. There is the occasion that their admittance granted them a whole degree. While these creatures and critters were very deserving of their awards, it's also noted that they were used as a device to uncover fraudulent activities in awarding institutes. There is at least one case of a cat's degree that aided in leading to the successful prosecution against the institution that had issued the award. That being said, Wikipedia goes on to list 7 cats, 8 dogs, and a goldfish, each of which have been awarded some sort of diploma or degree. This isn't a historical effort either, since the goldfish named Algernon received his award as early as 2021 through his owner George Monbiot, an environmentalist. George explained that Algernon was his childhood pet, and he's since been long gone. Despite no longer being here, his owner was still able to register him as a waste disposer. George had Algernon until he was 7 years old. One morning he found him floating on the surface of the tank, and that was the end of the little fish's existence, or so he thought. Weeks prior to publishing this article and registering the goldfish as a waste disposer, George had published a different article. It spoke of the failure to regulate waste disposal in the UK. There, he spoke of how millions of tons of waste are being mishandled by organized criminal records. It was during this time that the spirit of Algernon appeared to George. The fish revealed that his life's wish was to be registered as an upper-tier carrier, a broker, and a waste dealer. And this is exactly what the environmentalists did. Algernon became a certified waste disposer. We then move on to an earlier recording of a human-credentialed creature, the cat named Oliver Greenhalgh. On the 11th of December in 1967, Oliver the cat was admitted to the English Association of Estate Agents and Valuers. The idea was to get her into the fellowship program. Her human parent, Michael, was working with Television Wales in the West as a cameraman. At the time, he'd been investigating false professional associations. After paying 11 guineas, Oliver was accepted as a fellow of the English Association of Estate Agents and Valuers. Later, in 1973, Kitty O'Malley obtained a high school diploma from the Washington High Academy. This diploma, though, didn't get Kitty into any of the local colleges, and the institute was later placed under investigation. The page also lists another 5 cats, including Colby Nolan, who was awarded an MBA in 2004, sparking a fraud lawsuit. Henrietta, who was registered as a member of the American Association of Nutritional Consulates. George was registered as a hypnotherapist. Oreo Collin, too, was granted a high school diploma from an online institute. And Zoe D. Katsy obtained a psychotherapy certification. And when we head over to the dog section of the page, Maxwell Sniffingwell, the English Bulldog, was owned by a veterinarian named Dr. Ben Mays. In 2009, he obtained a degree in theriogenealogy on behalf of the pup. Then in 2017, a dog named Ollie found herself sitting on the editorial boards of 7 medical journals. She was also reinvented as Dr. Olivia Dahl by her owner, a public health expert named Mike Daw. Her credentials include the fact that she was a past associate of the Shenton Park Institute for Canine Refugee Studies, where she was a rescue dog. The Global Journal of Addiction and Rehabilitation Medicine was also named as an associate editor. Wikipedia has a dedicated page to the existence of the Yevla goat, a strange traditional Christmas display that is annually erected on the first day of Advent at the Castle Square in the center of Yevla, Sweden. The page features the rich history, the repeated destruction, and an extensive timeline of the Yevla goat. The construction is based on the Yule goat and is a representation of the Yule celebrations. Yule is the celebration of the winter solstice and spans over 10 days, starting on the 21st of December. Origins of Yule and the Yule goat date back to the ancient pagan festivals. It's been theorized that the goat is connected to the worship of Thor, the Norse god who rode on a chariot drawn by 2 goats. The role of this creature has changed over time. The idea of the goat was used by the Scandinavians, who would dress them up as horned beasts to pull pranks on the town. And the people of Sweden believed that the Yule goat was an invisible creature that appeared around Christmas. The tradition of the Yevla goat began in 1966, when an advertising consultant, Stig Galvin, came up with the idea to build a giant version of the Yule goat. The design of the first one had been assigned to the fire department's chief, Jorgen. The department would come together each year from 1966 to 1970 to erect the straw-made beast. The first sculpture measured a height of 43 feet tall, and it promptly became the center of a vandalism act. The goat was rebuilt each year following, with the occasional repeated destruction by vandalists and arsonists. The timeline that Wikipedia and the Strange Ways had laid out for us details each year from 1966 until the present, when the goat was put up on display during the Christmas holiday. It shows that on the 31st of December, 1966, it was vandalized and reduced to ash. The following 2 years, the display was allowed to survive, and a fence was added for further protection. In 1969, with more added fencing, the goat again was reduced to ash. The following year, it met the same fate, just 6 hours after it was constructed. In 1971, it was smashed to pieces. It collapsed the following year, and the next, it was the subject of a brazen thief. The man was later sentenced to 2 years in prison for aggravated theft. It was again reduced to ashes, collapsed, and then hit by a car, reduced to ashes, kicked into pieces, and then broken at 1979's Christmas festival. It managed to evade destruction again in 1981, but then the fires continued and its legs were broken. In 1987, it was fireproofed, but this didn't help much, and it was destroyed again. It managed to survive in 1988 and 1990, when it became heavily guarded by volunteers, and in 1992, again, ashes. It was later guarded by the Swedish Home Guard, surviving in 1993 and 1994, and again in 96. In 97, it sustained some damage, but was still left standing. This routine continued until 2022, when it survived after a 24-hour, real-time public webcam was installed, along with a double fence and 24-hour guards. In 2023, it saw the same security measure but was destroyed little by jackdaws who were foraging for food. Today, the goat is being guarded by a fence and security cameras when it's put up for display. This Wikipedia page, dedicated to the Yevla goat, has become one of the most extensive and most researched historical events to ever be placed on Wikipedia. It can also be read in 21 languages, and the exact coordinates of the goat are available on the page. The Traveling Gnome Wikipedia page is dedicated to a garden gnome ornament that's traveling the world with its owner and being photographed at various famous landmarks. The concept of traveling gnomes dates back to the 1970s. It was during this time that the traveler, Henry Sunderland, took his 2 garden gnomes, Harry and Charlie, along with him, venturing around Antarctica. Henry is recognized as a gnomologist, artist, and tutor. In 1977, the explorer's life changed when he delivered his first gnome, Charlie, to the South Pole. Henry refers to his 2 gnomes as his friends. Unfortunately, Charlie would be left in a hut that caught fire, which stripped off all the gnome's paint. He was found among the rubble and reclaimed by his owner, who suggested that he was morphing and adapting to this new frozen climate. Traveling gnome also refers to a prank that originated in Australia back in 1986. A local newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald, reported on a strange event. In the eastern suburbs, a distressed gnome owner discovered that her beloved garden decoration had been stolen. She found a note stating, quote, "Dear Mom, couldn't stand the solitude any longer, gone off to see the world, don't be worried." The gnome then signed off the note with, "Love, Bilbo." A similar incident occurred in Stamford, England. Gnomes were being taken for a trip around the world. From there, the traveling gnome prank was born, which often made national news. People would steal other people's garden decorations and then take them elsewhere. They would also send back pictures of the gnome to their owners as if to taunt them. The perpetrators would even leave behind cryptic messages that were supposedly written by the inanimate objects. One of the more notable instances of gnome traveling involved Gnome Severson. In 2005, Severson was kidnapped by a group of college students from a home in Redmond, Washington. They took the ornament on a road trip to Nevada and California. Severson would make national news after the group ran into Paris Hilton, who posed with the gnome. After a week-long vacation, Severson was anonymously returned to the owner's front porch, along with the photo album titled Gnome's Spring Break 2005. And if that wasn't odd enough, a French group formed the Garden Gnome Liberation Front, dedicated to freeing the ceramic statues. This formation came after Paris's Chic Bagatelle Gardens opened up the very first gnome dedication garden. It featured an estimated 2,000 statuettes that were placed among lilacs and peonies. During a nighttime raid organized by the front, 20 gnomes were liberated. They claimed responsibility and demanded that all garden gnomes be released back into their natural habitats. They also called for the prevention of ridiculing the small ornaments. In 1997, the front was fined for the sudden disappearance of 150 gnomes, and another incident involved 11 of them being attributed to the group. The idea of the traveling gnome would be introduced into the media as a subplot to the British soap Coronation Street. It was also popularized in the 2001 film Amelie. It also became the basis for Travelocity's advertising campaign, Where's My Gnome? And it's also the basis of the fantasy story called The Garden Gnome Freedom Front by Laura Frankos. Disappearing gnomes would also find themselves as a recurring Easter egg hidden in the Sims computer game series. Wikipedia also details a rather disturbing event that took place in 2007. It was in the morning hours of January 31st. A battery-powered LED placard of the Moonanites from the animated series Aqua Teen Hunger Force added some color to the morning scene. The characters were placed all throughout Boston, Massachusetts, as well as surrounding cities like Cambridge and Somerville. They also acted as part of a nationwide advertising campaign for the Aqua Teen Hunger Force : movie film for theaters. But what seemed like innocent light-up placards soon drew the attention of the Boston Police Department and the Boston Fire Department, who collectively and mistakenly identified the Moonanites as improvised explosive devices. Each placard device measured 1 by 1.5 feet and was strapped with D batteries along with electrical tape for installation and insulation. According to the Massachusetts Attorney General, Martha Coakley, these devices took on a sinister appearance with the attached battery and jutting wires. The story began at 8:05 that morning when a civilian spotted a light-up Moonanite attached to a supporting section of Interstate 93. He approached a policeman from Massachusetts, and a few moments later, the police department arrived. They responded with what's been described as an army of emergency vehicles, including ambulances, police, helicopters, and fire trucks. This sudden attention drew a large crowd as well as live TV news reporters. Soon, the man who made the apparent explosives, Peter Brodowski, would arrive on the scene. He'd recognized the device that was under investigation since he was the one who made it, but he didn't inform them of what it was or that they were mistaken. He headed back to his apartment and made contact with Interference, who told him that they would handle the situation. Wikipedia then went on to detail the sheer panic that came after all of this. The entire northbound side was shut down, along with the public transportation system. At 10 a.m., the device was destroyed despite not confirming if it was or wasn't an explosive device. 20 minutes later, the police reported that it was a hoax, but that wasn't the end of the Moonanite panic. At 12:54 that same day, the police received another call for another device situated at the intersection of Stewart and Charles Street. Then, after 1 p.m., the state police requested assistance from explosive specialists after identifying more devices beneath the Longfellow and Boston University bridges. Both bridges were closed, and the Coast Guard was instructed to prevent river-to-boat traffic. At 1:26, 5 hours into the Moonanite panic, Peter Brodowski's friends received an email from him. He stated that Interference Incorporated had instructed him to keep everything quiet. Another 2 hours went by, and Interference contacted their client, Cartoon Network, and told them about the ongoing situation. Between 2 and 3 p.m. that day, the police analyzed the images on the devices and found that they were, in fact, the Moonanite characters. They concluded that the entire incident was a publicity stunt. At the time that the panic erupted, the placards had already been in place for 2 to 3 weeks and had somehow gone so unnoticed that everyone believed they were rigged explosives. Peter and his coworker, Sean Stevens, were going to be charged with placing hoax devices and initiating a scare, but they agreed to perform community service instead and make a public apology. The Wikipedia article served as one of the longer reads that they've published. It spoke in depth about the planning, the devices, the panic that came after, the reaction of the public and media, the aftermath, and lastly, the event's historical legacy. If you'd like to check out the timeline for inventions and discoveries of specific ethnic groups, Wikipedia is the place to go. One Reddit user, Colorful Synthete, took to the funny subreddit, explaining that they just happened to be looking up some Irish inventions when they stumbled across the Wikipedia page dedicated to it, Timeline of Irish Inventions and Discoveries. The page explains that the list below refers to objects, techniques, and processes that came into existence through Irish individuals. It begins its comprehensive list with prehistory, detailing the invention of the Ogham, an early medieval alphabet. It moves to the 6th century, where we find the invention of the penitential, a set of church rules. Then we find ourselves in the 14th century. Here, the Irish invented céad, a precursor to Gaelic football. Then we have the Northern Regenians' anthem, and finally, whiskey. This last 14th century invention will be the center of this strange mystery. Whiskey is a type of liquor that's made using fermented grain mash, such as corn, wheat, rye, or barley. It's often aged in a wooden cask made from charred white oak. The word whiskey is an assimilation of a Gaelic term which means water. Distilled alcohol was known in Latin as the water of life. The first recorded mention of the Irish water of life was as early as 1405. And then we skip right into the 17th century, with the next recorded invention being Irish road bowling. A notable 300-year gap forms between the invention of whiskey and the invention of Irish road bowling, and everyone would like to know why. This random gap has gone entirely unexplained. No new inventions or discoveries were made by the Irish until a whole 300 years later, and the next invention was the most random sport, road bowling. This invention took place sometime later in the 1600s, at a time when Ireland had kings. The sport involves competitors who must attempt to take the fewest amount of throws to propel a metal ball along a particular predetermined course. In the case of the 1600s, prior to modernization, stone balls were used instead. The premise is quite similar to golf. Road bowling was found to have originated in Armagh and Cork. It's suggested, though, that this was the Dutch troops who brought the idea to Ireland amid the Williamite War in Ireland. Then, the inventions to follow seemed to resume their course. Modern chemistry was founded, Boyle's Law was discovered, and then entrepreneurship was established. But that 300-year gap still remains in question to this day. Did the invention of whiskey distract from creation and invention? Their first mention after the creation of the liquor was to figure out how to bowl on roads. Why does everything return to normal right after the invention of traditional sports, as though nothing happened? This aspect seems to have concerned many social media users over the past few years. It not only did the rounds on Reddit, but was also brought up on Facebook, sparking confusion and humor among the comments. It later found itself on the iFunny platform, where one user detailed that their favorite part in Irish history is the 300-year vacation they took after the creation of whiskey. Deep within the many lists that Wikipedia publicly offers is one of unexplained sounds. The page lists a variety of unidentified or formerly unidentified sounds, some of which are well known. The page even offers sped-up audio files with raised frequencies. Many of the sounds have been detected by the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, using their Equatorial Pacific Ocean Autonomous Hydrophone Array. The first sound to make the list has been ominously dubbed the upsweep. This is a strange sound that was detected by the hydrophone array. The unidentified sound was present when the NOAA Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory started to record its own sound surveillance system, SOS-US. In 1991, it recorded a train from ascending narrowband sounds, each of which was 3 seconds in length. The association noted that the sound seemed to occur during certain seasons. It was observed to have reached its peak in spring and autumn, but it remains unclear if this is due to the time change in propagation, or if the source of the sound itself has changed during this time. The sound seems to be emanating from the deeper areas of the ocean, but to investigate them, an advanced submersible that can withstand high pressure is needed. It's believed that the location of the sound lies approximately 54 degrees south and 140 degrees west between New Zealand and South America. It was also determined that there wasn't enough of a variation to conclude that the upsweep is being made by an animal. The audio present on the page adds to the eeriness of its existence. This audio, though, doesn't compare to the next inexplicable sound on the list, the whistle. It was picked up by the NOAA in 1997, with the source lying somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. According to the organization, the whistle is quite similar to volcanogenic sounds that were recorded before. Only one hydrophone was used, though, when this sound was found, instead of the 3 that are required to triangulate a location. leaving the exact source a mystery. The hydrophone, though, was said to have been deployed at 8 degrees north and 110 degrees west. Formerly unidentified sounds also include the bloop, the well-known mysterious sound. The bloop is named after an ultra-low frequency and very powerful sound that was also detected in 1997. It mimics the sound of noises that are made by ice quakes present in larger icebergs, or icebergs scraping along the bottom of the floor. It was later discovered that the low-frequency sound was in fact made by a glacier that was breaking apart after an ice quake. The sound Julia was discovered in 1999, with the source likely being an iceberg that had run aground off Antarctica. The sound, though, was loud enough to be heard all over the hydrophone. It lasted 2 minutes and 43 seconds. Julia's origin was narrowed down to somewhere between Bransfield Straits and Cape Adair. The mysterious call sounded like the vocalizations of a woman underwater, hence its name. Misinformation later spread online about a shadowy figure being seen in the same area by Apollo 33A5, which was later proven to be a hoax. Slowdown was recorded in May of 1997 and was again attributed to a large iceberg. But despite this identification, the low hum of the audio is still fear-instilling. In August of 1953, Lampo, a mixed-breed brown and white stray dog, hopped off a cargo train in Italy. It was said that he'd gotten off the train as though it was the most natural thing. He was friendly and well-natured. He was promptly adopted by the station master, Elvio Barlettani, even though the rail regulation strictly prohibited it. When Lampo got off the train, the station master and his daughter, Myrna, witnessed it. She quickly grew very attached to the dog, and Elvio had no choice but to let her keep him. But then, something odd and unexpected happened. Lampo learned the train schedules. He could even distinguish between the faster and slower moving trains. He knew exactly which ones to get on every day and would always return by sunset. He knew precisely which train would arrive when and where. He would regularly board other trains and traverse himself across Italy's railroad network, returning home each day. Lampo even managed to distinguish between each car of the trains, with his preference being the dining car. He would enter a train and head through each platform before stopping at the restaurant car, barking excitedly, hoping the cooks would toss him a meal. The train drivers would phone the station master to let him know where Lampo was and would leave the trail doors open to allow him to hop on. Sometimes the drivers wouldn't even start the train until they heard the dog's bark after the station master sounded the whistle ring. Unfortunately, though, a few years later, the railway management of Florence made the station master remove the dog. He was placed on a cargo train to Naples, but after just a few days, Lampo returned. He was later given to a friend of Elvio and Barletta, but after another 5 months, he again returned to the station, but he was mangy and terribly thin. Soon, Lampo's health recovered and he was officially declared the mascot of the railway. His story was so strange and so intriguing that it attracted journalists from all over the world. Articles and television series were created in dedication to the train-traveling pup. Even at his passing, Lampo's story pressed on. In commemoration of him, railway workers and the American magazine This Week inaugurated a monument at the station. In 1962, Elvio published a book called Lampo, the Traveling Dog. In 1967, it was fictionalized by a Polish author and became reading material for third-grade classes in Poland. Lampo was declared the train timetable expert, with his extensive knowledge of the schedules and his ability to distinguish between each car and the slower or faster-moving trains. On the odd occasion, though, Lampo would make an error, and if he did, he would simply get off the train and wait for the right one. The Oakland Cemetery in Iowa City has a Wikipedia page dedicated to its existence. It can be found on the north side and has served as the main cemetery for the area since 1843. Over the years, it expanded to a 40-acre coverage. It's noted as a public institution where anyone can be buried. Also accompanying the cemetery's history is the local monument that stands with it, the Black Angel. This 8.5-foot tall statue was erected by Mario Corbo in 1913 as a memorial to a man named Nicholas Feldevert. It's also been subject to the stories of curses and other disturbing tales. The story of the Black Angel starts in the late 19th century. It was during this time that a woman named Teresa moved to the area from Bohemia. Here, she had a son named Edward Dolzel. who passed in 1891. She erected a tree stump monument for her son's grave. Teresa divorced and later married a man named Nicholas Feldevert. Teresa went on to have a bronze angel statue made by the sculptor Mario Corbel. He was in Chicago at the time, and the angel was transported to Iowa City when it was completed. It was erected in 1915. After Nicholas passed away, his ashes were placed in a repository inside the base of the statue. When his wife passed, her ashes too were placed beside him. The monument displays the woman's day of birth, but strangely not the date of her passing, although it's been determined that it occurred in 1924. The statue has since been subjected to oxidation, giving the angel a greenish-black patina. The Black Angel is visited by students and other residents of the area. It's said to be an attraction during Halloween, and many gather around to test their luck by touching the supposedly cursed statue. It's been said that anyone who touches the angel will be fatally struck, and pregnant women shouldn't dare to walk beneath it. While the angel doesn't look particularly menacing, there are many fatal myths surrounding the Black Angel. It's said that each Halloween, she turns one shade darker as a reminder to those whose lives she supposedly took. The myths state that the inanimate statue would cause an instant passing to anyone who touches or kisses her. If one were to touch the angel at midnight on Halloween, they would meet their demise in 7 years. Even making eye contact with her will bring the offender an unknown disease. There are also a few peculiarities to this particular statue. While most grave angels are built in an uplifting manner, with their heads and wings toward the sky, this one has her face toward the ground, with one wing higher up, shadowing over the cement tree stump. Residents nearby have also been found scraping the statue while scratching their heads, trying to figure out how the statue became so dark. Many have come to suggest that the Black Angel harbors a demonic presence or perhaps a ghost. We now find ourselves on the more disturbing Wikipedia page, simply titled Human. As you may have guessed, it details the entire existence of Homo sapiens. The page speaks of our evolution, history, habitat, population, biology, genetics, life cycle, and so much more. It details the existence in full depth. But one Reddit user noticed something odd about the entire article. Inept Noob took to the subreddit Wikipedia, linking to this very article, and he stated that the entire page is just incredibly eerie because it reads as though an alien had written it. The Wikipedia article certainly does speak of us in a way that makes it appear that it was written by a different species. Tweet Sauce brought up the same thing on Twitter. He also linked the same article, captioning it, "The Wikipedia article on humans is written as if not by a human." In the opening, the article declared that Homo sapiens, or modern humans, are the most widespread species of primate. If that wasn't weird enough, the article then goes on to refer to us humans as they. It details that they are great apes, as though the writer was not a human individual. This particular Wikipedia page lists in-depth aspects of humanity, making the reader feel as though they've been watched or observed by an unseen entity that's documented its findings. The article becomes increasingly alarming. It speaks of the social interactions that humans have and how they've established a variety of values, languages, and traditions. According to the article, humans are incredibly curious creatures who have exhibited the desire to understand. Wikipedia also says that humans have an unexplained motivation in developing science, mythology, religion, and technology, along with other frameworks of knowledge. Adding to this is that humans have been known to study themselves through domains of science, history, and psychology. The article itself is interesting and knowledgeable, but Wikipedia finds itself under fire for its use of words and sentence structure. There's another related article titled "How Wikipedia Portrayed Humanity in a Single Photo." This is the same photo used on the original page. The article explains that there exists no ideal specimens for Homo sapiens, but that the internet needed to portray something, so they used a couple from Thailand to represent humans collectively. But this wasn't always the picture that represented all of humanity. Carl Sagan and his wife Linda had drawn up two figures, both of which ended up looking like Europeans with characteristic 1970s haircuts. This image was then used as Wikipedia's single leading photo of humanity, which was called the Pioneer Plaque. It stayed in this position for the next 5 years, but for some reason the editors decided to replace Sagan's example by using the Thailand couple, who've been representing humanity for more than 10 years. The entirety of the article seems to have a non-human writer, although Wikipedia has been open to suggestions on how to improve the description of humans that it's given us. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that you have no idea what your name is, where you're from, and where your family is. It's a scenario usually reserved for the movies, but one that played out in the life of a man who, for some reason, went by the name of Benjamin Kyle. In 2004, the man, who hailed from Jacksonville, Florida, was found unresponsive and unclothed outside of a Burger King restaurant in Richmond Hill, Georgia. When he was examined by doctors at a hospital, it was determined that he'd been assaulted, and when he woke up, told hospital staff that he couldn't remember who he was. But he did recall that he was born 10 years to the day before Michael Jackson, which was the 29th of August, 1948. In an attempt to help him get his memory back, he underwent hypnosis therapy and recalled part of his social security number, which revealed that he may have come from Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, or Illinois. Genetic testing suggested that his last name may have either been Powell or Davidson, or that he may have been related to someone with those names. Further hypnosis suggested that he may have lived with 2 or 3 other brothers, but he couldn't remember their faces, names, or where they lived. He also remembered spending time in Indianapolis when he was a child, specifically the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, Woolworth's on the Circle, and the Indiana Theater, where he recalled watching cinema films. He stated that he used to spend a quarter on grilled cheese sandwiches and a nickel on a glass of milk at the Indiana State Fair, and was determined that he may have attended a Catholic school at some point. He scoured through old yearbooks from schools in the Indianapolis area, but found nothing that further jogged his memory. When he was shown photos of Indianapolis, he recognized the Fountain Square Theater, but not the Grenada Theater, suggesting that he was in the area between 1954 and 1963. Furthermore, he recalled spending time in Denver's metropolitan area, since he could name the round-the-corner restaurant on the hill, as well as the Flatirons and Fox theaters. It was determined that he was in the area between the late 70s and early 80s. It was then determined that he'd spent time in Boulder between 1976 and 1983, and that he had extensive knowledge of the hospitality industry, specifically food preparation and restaurant management. But he couldn't remember anything else about his life after 1980, other than the attacks on the Twin Towers, and couldn't explain what he was doing in Georgia. He could only recite the names of US presidents from the 20th century, while just about everything else eluded him. When he saw himself in a mirror for the first time, he realized that he was at least 20 years older than he thought he was, and he would eventually be released from the hospital, still none the wiser as to who he was. He survived by living in shelters and doing yard work for the next 7 years. In an effort to put the mystery to rest, a sample of his DNA was sent to the FBI's National Criminal Justice Information Services Division in West Virginia, and through a series of elimination, his relatives were finally identified in September of 2015. It was discovered that his real name is William Burgess Powell, and he originally hailed from Lafayette, Indiana. He stated at the time that he planned on visiting his relatives, though it's uncertain whether he ever did. But he now finally knew who he was and could start living a normal life, at least as much as possible. Number 9. If you were to switch on your car radio, only to be greeted by a strange sequence of beeps and clicks, you would likely think it was faulty and needed to be replaced. But what if your brand new radio then did the same thing, and you realized that these sounds are being broadcast on purpose? It's enough to make anyone feel uneasy, which is exactly what happened with a strange radio broadcast for at least 10 years between 1982 and 1992. During that time, a shortwave radio station transmitted what sounded like nonsensical clicking and beeping, leading to much speculation from those who heard it. Even more strangely, the station never started broadcasting, and many people found it disconcerting that it was on the air 24/7. Then, in 1992, the sound suddenly changed. Rather than the beeping that was heard before, it started broadcasting strange buzzing sounds. When efforts were made to trace the signal, it was found to come from a small military city on the outskirts of Poverovo. And as strange as this was, it was about to get even weirder. A few weeks into the broadcast, listeners suddenly heard a man's voice that started reciting numbers and words. Sometimes the voice would read out names like Anna, Nikolai, Ivan, Tatiana, and Roman, and once this was done, the station would continue broadcasting the strange buzzes, and no one could figure out why. People started tuning into the station to hear what could happen next, and it was quickly found that there would be a series of 2 specific buzzes every hour on the hour. The signals, names, and words that were broadcast were documented by a few people who'd been enthralled by the mystery, but they still couldn't find its purpose. Then, on the 5th of June, 2010, the station suddenly went completely silent. No buzzing was heard, the male voice was strangely absent, and it seemed as though the mystery would never be solved. But the following day, the broadcast started once more, the only difference being that it sounded at times as though Morse code was being tapped on a microphone, but all else remained the same. In August, it fell silent twice more, but started back up again each time. People were still tuning in, and on the 25th of August, at 10:13 a.m., there was a brief silence followed by sounds that indicated that someone was in the same room as the microphone, as they could be heard shuffling around and moving things in the room. In September, listeners reported hearing short sections of what sounded like Tchaikovsky's Dance of the Little Swan. And on the 7th of that month, a male voice was heard saying Mikhail, Dmitri, Genya, Boris. Next, the voice recited a series of numbers and names, including 04979, DREN, and TRENERSKIY. Soon enough, as many as 40,000 people were tuning into the station, and when the mystery became known all over the world, hundreds of people started trying to decipher the messages. Some people speculated that signals were being sent to Russian spies through the broadcast, or that it had something to do with the Soviet Union's nuclear missile program. Others suggested that orders were being sent to Russian soldiers in the country, rather than spies who were on foreign soil. The station still broadcasts the strange sounds and messages today, and its purpose remains unknown, though it is assumed by most that it's being run by the Russian military to broadcast secret information. Number 8. The American industrialist Francis Lewis Clark was the founder of the CNC Mill and Elevator Company, which eventually became the biggest flouring mill in the Pacific Northwest. He was also the founder of America's Cup Sailing competition. He and his wife, Winifred, lived on the 7th Avenue in Spokane, Washington, but also had a summer home in Idaho on Hayden Lake. In 1906, he became the vice president of the Inland Railway Island Company, but 8 years later, he would become the subject of a mystery that remains unsolved today. On the 16th of January, 1914, Winifred was on her way to visit family in San Francisco. She would be traveling there by train and was accompanied by her husband, a valet, and a chauffeur who saw her off at a train station in Santa Barbara. The couple had been on holiday in California, and some reports state that they got into an argument on the way there, but this has never been confirmed. But whatever the case may be, they reached the train station and Francis bid her farewell with a kiss. Inexplicably, he then told his chauffeur to drive back to the hotel alone, as he felt like walking back on his own, adding that he would see him in the morning. The hotel was only about a mile from the station, but he never made it back there and remains missing today. The following morning, when his chauffeur couldn't locate him, he was reported as missing, and when a search was conducted, his hat was found on the beach between the station and the hotel, leading many people to suggest that he'd walked into the ocean to end his own life. The chauffeur told investigators that Clark hadn't been in the best of health, and likely would have found the mile-long walk rather taxing, but added that he seemed to be in a good mood when he last saw him. Then, 2 weeks later, the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper received an anonymous letter stating that Clark had been abducted and was being held for ransom. The letter demanded $75 in payment for his release. Investigators asked for proof that he was still alive, and when they received none, it was written off as a hoax. In 1929, a fake medium called Margaret Kelly told the police that Clark had his life ended during a robbery, which she was a part of, but her claims were quickly dismissed since she couldn't provide any proof. In the following years after his disappearance, people became even more infatuated by the case, And many theories were suggested, including that he'd simply decided to leave his old life behind and start somewhere new. Both his chauffeur and Winifred reiterated that he would never choose to end his own life, and his brother-in-law offered a $5,000 reward to anyone who was able to find him or point the police in the right direction. He speculated that Clark may have ended up in an asylum somewhere, or that he was indeed being held against his will by abductors. In the years that followed, Winifred did her best to manage all the couple's assets, including their estate, but she eventually found it too overwhelming and decided to sell everything, including her own possessions. No further clues were ever found, and Frances Clark's disappearance will likely never be solved. Number 7. The Guinness Book of World Records serves as a source of inspiration to many people who attempt to have their names included in its pages every year. And in order to accomplish the feat, they often partake in strange activities that we wouldn't normally associate with the world record. While we usually think of world records in terms of physical ability, such as running the 100-meter race in under 10 seconds or throwing a javelin over 300 feet, the book also contains some very outlandish records, such as Lee Redmond, a US woman who had the longest ever recorded fingernails, measuring an unbelievable 2 feet and 11 inches. A man named Donald Gorsk holds a record for eating the most Big Macs, 26,000 in his lifetime. The longest anyone has played video games continuously is 138 hours and 34 minutes, a record set by Carrie Swedecki from the US. But not all record attempts end well, even if the record is broken. On the 27th of September, 1986, United Way, an international network of non-profit affiliates, decided to try their hand at a world record in what they described as a fundraising publicity stunt. The plan was to release a total of 1.5 million balloons, more than have ever been released at once, and it would take 6 months for the preparations to be completed. It was decided that the event would take place in the southwest quadrant of Public Square in Cleveland, and a massive structure 3 stories high was set up and covered by a one-piece net to keep the balloons from floating away. 2,500 people worked under the net, inflating balloons with helium, and outside, sponsorships were sold at $1 for every 2 balloons. When the preparations were finally completed, more than 100,000 people arrived to watch the spectacle. But when an approaching rainstorm threatened to disrupt the event, the decision was made to release the balloons early. At 1:50 p.m., the net was removed, and the massive amount of balloons started to float into the sky, amongst cheers from the crowds. But unbeknownst to them, the situation was about to spiral out of control, despite the record now being broken. Instead of floating into the sky and away from the square, the still inflated balloons drifted into the front of cool air and rain, and started descending back to the ground. This caused havoc on roadways, as motorists were either distracted by the spectacle or couldn't see where they were going, resulting in several accidents. The roads and waterways became clogged up by balloons, and when they drifted onto the Burke Lakefront Airport's runways, it had to be closed down for 90 minutes so that the debris could be cleared away. But no one could have expected that the event would interfere with the missing person investigation. 2 men, Raymond Broderick and Bernard Sulzer, had been reported missing when they didn't return from their fishing trip on Lake Erie the previous day. Their abandoned boat was found on the morning of the event, and the Coast Guard found it almost impossible to search the lake, thanks to the sheer amount of balloons that ended up in the water. Since they were looking out for an orange life jacket or a person's head bobbing above the water, the balloons turned the search into a farce, with searchers stating that around 100,000 orange balloons were floating on the lake. The search was eventually called off 2 days later, and the 2 men were found deceased shortly afterward, with the cause of their passing being determined as drowning. This resulted in a lawsuit being filed by one of the men's wives against the United Way of Cleveland and the Balloon Fest organizers, and the matter was eventually settled outside of court. The record for the most balloons released simultaneously had been reached and was included in the Guinness Book of World Records in 1988, but the category was then retired as the activity was seen as too dangerous. Number 6. 20-year-old Eda Reel was born in Providence, Rhode Island in May of 1914, but her family eventually moved to Worcester in Massachusetts. After graduating from high school, she attended Worcester State Teachers College, while Henry Sewin, a man who she had dated in the past, attended Bates College in Maine, though he would eventually drop out and start working at a garage in New York. Eda and Henry were no longer together, but they remained friends, and he even helped her make payments towards her college education. In 1934, Eda got pregnant and revealed that Henry was the father of the baby. Henry maintained that he wasn't the father, and Eda ended up filing a paternity lawsuit against him. The date for the hearing was set for the 21st of November, and in the meantime, Eda was spending time with one of her friends, a woman called Teresa, along with the baby, a girl named Alma. At around 10 p.m. on the night before the hearing, Henry suddenly showed up at Teresa's house, stating that he just needed to talk to Eda. She reluctantly agreed to leave with him since he stated that he just wanted to talk. Later that night, Eda's hairdresser saw the pair, and a police officer would later state that he'd seen Henry's car where it was parked outside of Eda's house. He stated that he last saw it there at about midnight that night. When her family woke up the next morning, they saw Eda packing some of her belongings and asked her what she was doing. She stated that she decided to marry Henry and that the two were planning to elope and get married in New York. Her family didn't think this was a good idea and tried to talk her out of it, but she stated that she would be back home later that week after the wedding to get their daughter. Her family couldn't do anything to stop her, and Eda left. Later that same day, one of her sisters bumped into Henry while she was out in town, and confused as to why he was there, she asked why he wasn't with Eda. Henry looked equally as baffled and told her that she'd asked him to drop her off at a train station, which he did. When asked about the trip to New York, he stated that he knew nothing of it, and added that they'd never discussed getting married. According to Henry, they'd spoken about the paternity case that evening, and Eda had finally admitted that Alma wasn't his child. Eda never returned home and was never seen or heard from again. When Henry was questioned by the police, he said that she had admitted to having an affair with at least 2 married men, and that she was worried about her reputation being ruined. Hence, she named Henry as the father, and when that didn't work, she decided to leave town out of embarrassment. Eda's lawyer reported that he'd received a telegram from her on the 2nd of December, in which she stated that she wanted to withdraw from the paternity case. Many people feel that the telegram wasn't actually sent by her. Strangely, 3 passengers who were at the station on the night that Eda disappeared called the train dispatcher between 2 and 4 a.m., with one stating that he was the switchboard operator for Oxford. They asked that she not be allowed on the train, but when it was searched, she was nowhere to be found. It was later determined that no such call was made by the Oxford switchboard operator. Eda was never found, despite many people claiming to have seen her after the fact, but none of these sightings were ever confirmed. Her daughter was raised by Eda's sister and brother-in-law, and Henry passed away in 1998. Eda's case has never been solved, and we may never know whether she ever traveled to New York or even made it to the train station. Number 5. Every few years, an individual or group claims to have information that the world is about to end, and very often this results in people all over the world making preparations for our planet's demise. All of these predictions have obviously been wrong, but that hasn't stopped people from coming up with other scenarios that could lead to the world's end, one of which is referred to as the gray goo. The term was first coined by futurist and engineer Kim Eric Drexler, and is used to describe nanomachines that may eventually be responsible for the demise of mankind, since they could replicate exponentially. If this were to happen, they would eventually consume all the matter on Earth. Since nanotechnology manipulates matter at a molecular level, many people have been brought into the theory, and they're now worried that we may meet our end at the hands of these tiny machines, however unlikely that may seem. Drexler authored a book called Engines of Creation, in which he speculates that nanomachines, called assemblers, could potentially be used one day to build certain materials one molecule at a time. If enough of these assemblers were used, they could build pretty much any material imaginable, as long as the correct molecules were used in the right sequence. He also proposes a theory as to how this could be done. The first of the machines would be created in a laboratory, after which they could be programmed to create more assemblers. With each new generation, the assembly process increases exponentially, and before long, millions or even billions of nanomachines will exist. The problem that he foresees with this process is that the nanomachines may reproduce at such a rate that they could no longer be effectively monitored, and when this happens, their reproduction may spiral out of control. In order to keep producing nanomachines, the assemblers would need to use matter, and as time went by, they would need more and more, since their reproduction is exponential. Before long, the oceans would disappear. Trees would be torn down, and every piece of matter on Earth would be used to create more machines, eventually leading to only the assemblers being left. But the scenario remains extremely unlikely. It's suggested that we would recognize the problem long before it became critical, and devise a way of dealing with the machines. Furthermore, when the assemblers are created, scientists could program them with certain limitations that'll stop them from replicating without end. Number 4. It isn't often that a spirit that's said to haunt a certain area changes its personality. The legend of the haunting is usually well known, and is passed down through the generations without much embellishment. But this isn't the case with a spirit that's said to haunt Huntington College in Montgomery, Alabama. The ghost, known to those in the area as the Red Lady, has apparently been roaming the halls of the college since 1854, when the building was called Tuskegee Women's College, since it was located there. One night, the women in the dorm were told to go to bed, since it was time for lights out. But just a few minutes later, students on the top floor started noticing a strange red glow coming from the hall outside their rooms. They could see the glow coming into their rooms through the gaps under the doors, and when a few gathered enough courage to investigate, they opened their doors to find a strange apparition, that of a woman standing in the hallway. She was reported to be wearing a red gown and carrying a red parasol while emitting a red glow, and simply walking up and down the hallway, seemingly with no real purpose. They tried to get her attention, but seemed completely oblivious to her surroundings and the students who were present. The women would later report that she remained in the hallway until the sun came up, at which point she simply vanished as if she was never really there. Strangely, the woman was never seen in the dormitory again, but the students who lived there continued to worry that she may return one day. In 1910, the decision was made to relocate the campus to Montgomery, where it became the Women's College of Alabama. The sighting of the apparition was now all but forgotten, but that quickly changed when a wealthy woman named Martha, or Margaret according to some sources, moved in. Martha didn't want to attend this specific college, but since her deceased father willed her to, she relented despite missing her home in New York. It soon became apparent to the other students that Martha loved the color red. She wore red outfits almost every day and decorated her dorm room with red items. They noted that even her bedspread and rug were red, but put it down to a matter of preference. But Martha was somewhat of a loner who didn't make friends easily, and according to her fellow students, went as far as to avoid being spoken to. Some of the other women didn't take kindly to this, as they mistook her shyness for contempt. Students who were placed in the same room as Martha would soon move out, stating that she almost never spoke and that the room had a strange, gloomy atmosphere. As a last-ditch effort to make her feel welcome, the president of the dorm decided to move in with Martha, but try as she might, she couldn't get her to brighten up and eventually also moved out, reiterating that the room seemed strangely depressing. On the day that the president was moving out, Martha walked in while she was packing and upon realizing what was happening, became overwhelmed with emotion, since she considered the woman to be her only friend on campus. She then inexplicably told her that if she went through with her plan to leave, she would live to regret it. But before long, the gloom that accompanied Martha followed her wherever she went, to the point that other students would leave whenever she entered a room. This caused her to become even more withdrawn, and she mostly remained in her room where she would retreat beneath her bedspread, which only caused her behavior to become even stranger. She started missing classes, and at night, would walk through the dorm's halls, opening and closing doors as she went. On some occasions, she would open doors and just stare at the women who lived there without ever saying a word. One night, the president of the dorm realized that Martha hadn't attended classes and hadn't eaten any meals. She decided to visit her to see if she was okay, but when she approached the room, she became aware of a strange red glow that could be seen beneath the door. Inside, she found Martha deceased, dressed in a red robe and covered with her red bedspread. It's said that she never left, still walking through the halls every night. Strange activity has been reported in the building ever since, and it's said to become worse on the anniversary of Martha's passing. The red glow can still be seen emanating from her room on occasion. Number 3. It's said that Nan Rouge, a red dwarf-like demon, has been roaming around Detroit for as long as the city has been in existence. The legend states that anyone who sees the creature, also known as the Red Dwarf of Detroit, will soon become the victim of an unfortunate or tragic event. The legend began back in 1701 at a party that was being held in St. Louis, Quebec. At some point during the festivities, a woman showed up along with a black cat that was sitting on her shoulder. She claimed to be a fortune teller and was invited in so that she could read the palms of those in attendance. All of her readings seemed to be remarkably accurate, and she eventually made her way over to Cadillac and told him that he would be the founder of a great city. Intrigued by this prediction, he continued to listen intently, but the fortune teller then told him that the city would become the site of a lot of trouble and strife at the hands of Native Americans and the British. She added that he needed to beware of his own ambition for his sake and that of his children. She also told him to appease the Nan Rouge and stated, "Beware of offending him. Should you be thus unfortunate, not a vestige of your own inheritance will be given to your heirs." He enjoyed the reading, but didn't think anything of it after the party was over. Her prediction would come true, though, when Cadillac became the founder of Detroit. And one night, while he was taking a walk with his wife, he heard someone complain about the city. He complained that the city couldn't continue to be run the way it was, and that his wife had seen Nan Rouge a few nights before. Cadillac's wife reminded him of what the fortune teller had said, and he shrugged it off and headed home. Before he reached his house, though, he was intercepted by a strange short creature with sharp teeth, and Cadillac struck out at it with his cane. The figure immediately fled, but as it did so, he and his wife could hear its menacing laugh, and he suddenly realized that he'd offended Nan Rouge despite the woman's warnings. Following the strange encounter, things took a bad turn for Cadillac. He was removed from his post and forced to move to Louisiana, which was considered to be a terrible place at the time, according to some sources. When he eventually passed away, none of his children inherited any of his possessions, just as the fortune teller had predicted. Since then, the dwarf has been spotted many times, and typically these sightings are followed by tragic or violent events. One sighting took place at the Detroit River in 1763, and the next day, the Battle of Bloody Run broke out. In 1805, it was seen again strolling down a street, and soon after, Detroit was decimated by a fire. In 1813, General William Hull surrendered the city to British forces, and he would later claim to have seen the figure just before he did so. It was also spotted before a riot broke out in the city in 1967, and before one of the city's worst ever ice storms occurred in 1976. Whether the Nan Rouge really does exist is up for debate, but the legend remains intact today, and will likely remain a part of Detroit for a long time to come. Number 2. Warren County in New Jersey is home to a two-way rural road that's known by the moniker Shades of Death Road. It runs along the Jenny Jump State Forest and an old lake bed that's said to be haunted, since many people have witnessed a strange fog, known as the Great Meadows Fog, rising from it on occasion. Some people who have seen the fog reported that it was filled with the souls of the departed who may have passed away, thanks to a curse that lay on the area in the past, though some people believe they passed away due to a plague that was present in the water. No one is certain how the road got its foreboding name, but there have been a few theories put forward over the years. Some people attribute it to the first settlers in the area, who were said to have been rowdy squatters. Fights would often break out amongst the men, either over a woman or some other petty squabble, and on occasion it would end with someone's life being ended. Over time, more people moved to the area, and the group was forced to live close to this road, which eventually led to it being given the strange name. Others believe the road used to be called the Shades, thanks to the shadows created by the overhanging trees. Thanks to the hidden nature of the road, many people were attacked there, some of whom lost their lives, and the word death was added to the name. It's also known that the area was ravaged by an outbreak of malaria somewhere around 1850, and that the tragic loss of life was responsible for the macabre name. Since then, the road has been seen as a place to avoid, and people continue to report strange events that occur there. On one occasion, a man was sitting in his car next to the meadow when he saw hay that had been laid on the ground start to move, as if someone was walking over it, but there was no one there. He got out and inspected the ground, and to his surprise, found footprints that he couldn't explain. Others have reported hearing an old piano, which is located inside an old abandoned cabin in the area, playing by itself as if some unseen hand was pressing on the keys. There have also been reports of footsteps that sounded like someone walking on broken glass in the same cabin, but no source has ever been found. On some occasions, people see two lights floating near a bridge in the area, and it's been suggested that these are the spirits of two people who passed away on the road. Other witnesses claim to have been accosted by the spirits, with one man ending up terrified after he was punched by an unseen hand. It's said that the road is guarded by a Native American man who takes the form of a deer. When he's spotted, he'll approach cars, and if they fail to stop in time, they'll be involved in a car accident shortly after. Many people choose to avoid the road at all costs after experiencing strange and inexplicable events there, and have vowed to never return. Number 1. In 2011, 28-year-old Jonathan Spallin was a very well-traveled journalist. He originally hailed from Ireland, but had lived in Cairo for 2 years as part of his job, after which he relocated to Abu Dhabi in the UAE to work as the assistant foreign editor for the national newspaper. Following that, he worked in Hong Kong, and by this point, according to his family, felt that he needed to take some time off, since he started working as soon as he graduated from college and never had the chance to travel the world at leisure. He told his mother that he felt the time was right to take a break for a while, before setting out for Nepal from Hong Kong. He arranged to have his camera and laptop sent back to Ireland. But his trip didn't have the best start. Soon after arriving in Nepal, he was robbed and decided to travel to Delhi in India instead. He could stay there until February the next year, since his visa was still valid for 3 months, and he visited at Varanasi before going to Rishikesh. Unbeknownst to his family, he wasn't in the best of health, as he'd been diagnosed with kidney stones, but he didn't let this hamper his plans, and he set out for a 5-day hike. He had a fall while on the hike, and when he returned, he contracted a stomach virus. Jonathan spoke to his mother, Linda, on the 3rd of February 2012, and told her that he'd grown tired of Delhi and the pollution that filled its air. He planned to leave India for somewhere with more nature, but the following day, he told her that he decided to go on a trek that would take him at least 2 weeks to complete. He noted that he may not be reachable by phone, but added that he would message his family whenever the cell phone signal was strong enough. He also chose to set out without a guide, something that worried his family, but they couldn't persuade him since it was a spiritual journey that he wanted to complete on his own. This was the last time that anyone spoke to Jonathan. He was reported missing in February, and the areas where he was planning to travel were thoroughly searched, but he was never found. His backpack, clothing, passport, book, sleeping bag, and money were found at a waterfall about 5 miles from Rishikesh, and some of his medical forms were discovered about 1.5 miles away, but no further clues were ever found. It's been suggested that he either disappeared willingly, following his spiritual quest, or that he was the victim of foul play. But with very little evidence to go on, his disappearance remains a mystery, and his whereabouts remain unknown to this day. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.